Good morning. My name is Camila Teran, and I am Team Assistant for Standards Division at GRI. Welcome to this meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym, the GSSB, held on the 18th of October 2022. This in-person meeting is being hosted from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that all public GSSB meetings are being recorded, and you can find the audio recording on the GSSB webpage, along with the high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. Present from the GRI Secretariat today are Bastian Buck, Chief of Standards, Harold Powells, Director Standards, Mia de Demar, Head of Standards, Sector Program, and Laura Espinach, Head of Technical Development of Standards. We will now start with a roll call. Anna Nefedova. Here. Corley LaRue.
Here.
Evan Harvey. Ganga Charam Sharma.
Available. Yes.
Julia Januardi.
Present.
Jennifer Prinsing.
Present.
Joseph Martin.
Present.
Kent Swift.
Present.
Kim Schumacher. Loredana Carta.
Present.
Michelle Washer.
Present.
Peter Colley.
Present.
Robin Leeson.
Present.
Vincent Kong.
Present.
GSSB Chair Judy Kuszewski.
Present.
Thank you, everyone. I will now hand over to the Chair, Judy Kuszewski, to open the meeting.
Thank you very much. Welcome, colleagues. Welcome to those who are joining us here in Amsterdam in person, as well as to those who are joining us remotely to this meeting of the GSSB. For the first time in 3 years now, we have an in-person multi-day meeting, and you're all very welcome. We are focusing most intently over these 2 days on our forthcoming work program for standards development, updates of standards, new standards. We will have some external presentations, as we have had at most GSSB meetings, I think, over the course of the last year or so, over these 2 days as well. Can I first of all confirm, do we in fact have quorum with the group present and online? If we have quorum, then we can proceed with the first item on the agenda, which is if you can move the slide deck forward. We're no longer in a private meeting. Keep going. And yep. And here we are at the agenda for the first portion of the meeting. Today, we will, after the just opening right now, we will have the approval of the first item, which is the draft summary of the 15th of September meeting. Followed by, we'll go straight into the discussion of item 2 in the materials pack, which is the discussion of the draft GSSB work program for the forthcoming 3-year period. We have lunch at 12 o'clock Amsterdam time, and then we have an external presentation from Worker Info Exchange. I have to note that the item that's in the agenda entitled placeholder input presentation, we will not need that. So we will at that point go into private session to talk about a number of administrative issues. And so we'll close the live stream at that point, but then reopen it following the break at 2:45 Amsterdam time. Any questions about the agenda or today's?
Can we move to the next slide, then we can go through the full agenda?
Right. Okay. So after the break, as I say, we'll go back into the public session at 2:45 Amsterdam time. We have a presentation from the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, followed by the continuation of the discussion around the GSSB work program. another break, we will then welcome Emmanuel Faber and Sue Lloyd, the chair and vice chair respectively, or one of the vice chairs of the International Sustainability Standards Board, to discuss our ongoing collaboration with that other body. We'll have a short summary, just reviewing what may have come out and any kind of issues that might be parked for the rest of the agenda, and close the meeting at 5:30 Amsterdam time. Any question, discussions? Shall we move straight then to the first item, which will be the summary, the approval of the draft summary. I beg your pardon, that was day 2's agenda that went up there. Maybe we'll review that tomorrow. I don't think we need to go over that right now. The scheduled approval right now is for the draft summary of the GSSB meeting held on the 15th of September 2022. Any discussion of this, corrections, edits anyone wants to make? Hearing none, that is approved. Thank you very much. And we will then move straight to the Standards Division team to talk us through the draft GSSB work program.
Thank you, Judy. And this will be a session that I will present together with Mia, Laura, and Harold. The aim of this session is to shed light on the detail of the draft GSB work program. That is the item 2 that has been shared as input for this meeting. We're aiming to discuss the distinct elements of the work program that actually will explain most of the activity in standard setting over the next 3 years. At least that's our proposal to the GSB at this point in time. And we want to make sure that you understand the considerations that went into scaling these different functions, also the interdependencies between these different functions are going to be an important part of what we need to pay attention to when we realize the ambition of doubling standard setting activity. And I think that is really the framing for the discussions in this first session and also the later session today. In light of GRI's commitment to double standard setting activity, but maybe to rephrase this a bit, to actually guarantee continuous improvement of all the standards that we have made available as a public good. We need to consider what that entails, in the short to medium term, in terms of looking at the legacy issues we have, so standards that are already in existence and that need attention, and then also within the purview of the 3-year work program, how we actually move towards then maintaining this set of standards in totality. And the one thing I would say is that we have very different levels of activity throughout the different elements of our work at this point in time. But what they all have in common is that they need to be scaled considerably to actually live up to this ambition. So when Laura, Harold, and Mia presenting, please also pay attention to that own logic on how we scale and what will fall under the mandate of the respective functions going forward. We will take time to discuss these different elements. I think we can ask the colleagues to present. If there are immediate questions in terms of understanding the presentation, just come in and we should be able to resolve them. And otherwise, I would suggest that we reserve items for discussion and then go through them. In reviewing this session, the team said that we should be able to look at the elements of the discussion paper, the item 2, a pause for clarification questions and a brief discussion, and then go into the topic standards with priority. Whether that then already bridges into the second session, we will see. But that was the idea behind this session. So again, the basis for the discussion is the item 2, also for those that are listening in. And if we can advance to the next slide. Wanted to briefly put this in context of the due process requirement that we have. So GSSB is required on a rolling basis to make publicly available a work program, to have a work program that spans 3 years. So every third year we get to revisit the ambition and also set out parameters for the next 3 years. This is the moment and now. We have the opportunity to have this coincide with the strategic planning of GRI overall. That is an important consideration for us. And we are actually able to have conversations now that coincide with the budgeting and planning for the next 3 years of GRI. So we're able to have also the operational and institutional support for our ambition. And I think that is a novelty so far. The strategic planning of the institution overall has not always been coinciding with the standard setting planning. And that's certainly something we are leveraging. As part of due process, we have to go for public consultation with a draft work program. The draft that is in front of you is, I would say, 60–70% maybe of what we would want to put out for public consultation. We're aiming to enrich the draft as it stands right now on basis of the discussions that we're having today and tomorrow, and then have a full draft in front of you in November for approval for public consultation. Because we're devising a 3-year work program in context of a larger strategic planning exercise for GI, that interaction with stakeholder council and board that is actually called for in the due process is even more relevant this time around. So we will also make sure, and Judy in actual fact has done that already at the past board meeting, make sure that they're aware of the ambition and what comes with it. But it doesn't stop there. I think and going external and actually looking at who are the stakeholders we want to weigh in on our programmatic efforts. This will be absolutely key. So the session now, while we won't spend much time on this in the first session, alignment with other standard setters, regulators, and so on will have to form part of our work program discussions as well. So and finding through public consultation also ways to get signals from not only the market as such, but importantly those that seem to drive reporting activity. That's key. The idea is to have a final work program in the first quarter next year. We have yet to determine the meeting early next year, and we will discuss that also when we have a chance to catch up on governance proceedings. But to give you a timeline and expectation, we will put the work program out for public consultation for at least 60 days, probably slightly longer than that, and then reconvene to review and confirm the work program in the first quarter. If we can move to the next slide. I think then one more reflection that I can spend time on the GSB work program. I think that the draft that you have in front of you, a lot of what we're suggesting here is actually based on the experience that we have had since 2016 in reviewing individual standards, developing the sector program, importantly piloting it. But we also try to already reflect a bit on stakeholder recommendations that we have had recently, right? So these are inputs, but that is of course not everything that we need to consider. So we're asking you also to help us to take a step back now, look at what we have on paper and where we need to augment contents at this point in time. think we're still struggling a bit with it. I think I covered most of this in passing. Maybe just one more thing here to say is we will also reflect on things that are strictly speaking not under due process, but form an important part of how the standards are actually set into the market. Translations I would use as an example. We also have an item on guidance that again wouldn't fall under the full due process, but seems to be an important additional element to our work, and we're receiving more and more feedback about this. So we have reserved some time for these discussions as well. Yes, and maybe last thing to say before I hand over to the team is that all of this is a draft, so really a suggestion by staff to the GSB at this point in time, and there's the opportunity to refine and adjust based on your feedback. Yeah. So this is the sequence by which we move through the elements. We will have a brief reflection on sector program, then the review of topic standards, new topic standards, research translations, and cooperation. And I think with that, I hand over to Mia, who will kick us off on the GRI sector program. I should also say that we have a second session on sector program specifically tomorrow, where we will expand on a couple of items, but it is good to anchor us in the activity that has been unfolding under the sector program in the past years.
Thanks very much, Bastian. I'm just going to turn my microphone up a little bit so that people on the YouTube can hear well. Thank you very much for having me today in this board session. It's a little bit strange. I'll sort of look at some of you and not others, so excuse me. But we get to start perhaps with the simple part of the work program, not because the sector program work is simple, but because a lot of the parameters have been pre-set up by a number of overarching documents that have been approved by the GSSB previously. So the proposal in the work program for the sector program is a continuation of that approach, and a continuation of essentially developing sector standards in line with a list of prioritized sectors that have previously been approved. Though in tomorrow's session, we do have an item with some slight adjustments, which basically have come about because of the projects we've done to date. We also found a couple of mistakes in that prioritization list. So it's just some very minor updates that there'll be the opportunity to discuss and then approve that item, hopefully tomorrow. But essentially, we'll continue on as we have been going. If we could go to the next slide, please, Camilla. Thank you. So this is a reminder of what that priority list looks like. And you might remember, for sort of grouping purposes, we've broken the list of priority sectors down into 4 groups. Basically, the first group of basic materials and needs was divided further out into the pilot projects, which are now complete, and then into another, I think that's 10 additional sectors called Group 1 in our priority list. And essentially the way this works is it's moving basically from the high impact upstream sectors that were identified as providing basic materials and needs through to through the value chains, if you like, of different products and services, down to other services and light manufacturing in Group 4. The pilot projects, I'll just remind everybody, have now been completed, and we've started the first sectors in that Group 1. So mining is well underway, and the others you have seen or will see in the following days. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So the thing about the outcome of the pilot projects is not, of course, the 3 standards that we've published, but also that we've been able to codify the approach that we take to developing sector standards and the way that we manage most or will manage most sector standards projects. And so that means that we're in a much better place to essentially project through the next 3 years. And what we know is that a development of a sector standard typically takes about 24 months to complete. This is from about the time that you start recruiting a working group through to the approval moment. So it doesn't take into account necessarily some background research or the work that we have to do in terms of translations and those sorts of things, but just that active development moment. And based on this process and current resource planning, which I'll talk to a little bit more in a second, the plan is that we will commence the development of standards for all priority Group 1 sectors during the period covered by this work program. So we won't be able to finish all priority Group 1 sectors, but we will commence all of them. In addition, I'll just mention here that we've made a further commitment, or we propose to make a further commitment in the work program, that in 2024, we would review the potential to expand the number of sector standards developed simultaneously. And this, of course, would just result in an acceleration of the time it takes us to move through this list. And so hopefully we'd get into the Group 2 industrial sectors. We can go to the next slide. No problem. Perfect. Thank you. So once again, I suppose you're going to see maybe the same things cut a few different ways throughout this presentation and throughout the next few presentations. But this is a reminder of how we would break down the Group 1 sectors. So we've already published, 11, 12 and 13. And we've already, to some degree, started the ones in the center column. So mining is well underway and going very, very well with the working group, and we're aiming for an exposure draft approval probably in the first meeting of the GSSB next year. We had initially intended to come to the final meeting of this year, but I think for various reasons, beginning of next year makes more sense. And to open up, if approved, we would open public comment in the first quarter. Food and beverages, textiles and apparel, you've already approved final project proposals. So we've been through the due process of doing the draft, of consulting the stakeholder council, and we've got those final project proposals sitting there. Inside the standards division, there's preparation work going on for opening the working group recruitment, and essentially this sort of public facing, if you like, opening of these projects is simply subject to resourcing. So we're currently in a recruitment phase, and we need to install standards managers to lead those projects. Banks, insurance and capital markets will have an opportunity to discuss in detail tomorrow. That's coming to you as a single project proposal, draft project proposal at this stage, called financial services. But the plan would be to produce 3 separate standards there. And that would leave us essentially with utilities, renewable energy, which I would like to mention. It's been brought up before by the GSSB that potentially there's sufficient overlap between these 2 sectors that they should be considered a single sector, or at least the subject of a single sector standard. So the current plan is that we would further investigate the combining of those 2 during the research phase, but they've tentatively been grouped as sort of a single project at a minimum at this stage for planning purposes, and then forestry and metal processing. I think we can move to the next slide. Oh, yes, that was just to demarcate the grouping of those. Thank you. Okay, so this sort of colorful slide gives you some idea of how we overlay the projects with the current resourcing. So what you can't see on here, of course, is a team structure. But currently, based on current capability, capacity, and limitations within the organisation, and also within the standards division, we're looking to grow to 5 standards managers. And essentially, this allows us to structure ourselves in the sector program into 4 project teams. Most project teams are made up of a single standards manager and a supporting senior standards officer, plus staff from other parts of the division and the organization. So we also need to have access to research resources, writers, technical content specialists, which sit in Laura's team, communication support, and so on. And what we've done, and you'll notice I said 5 standards managers, 4 project teams. That's because the financial services project of banks, insurance, and capital markets is a very high sort of volume project. So we'll have more than one manager sitting within that team. I've allowed for a very conservative timeframe here for all the projects. So essentially the yellow boxes demarcate internal work, so background research and project proposal preparation. The light blue demarcates a period of time to recruit for the working group. The darker blue is the time when we're actually developing content, public comment, those sorts of things. And the orange at the end shows the work that needs to be done to get the standard into the publication tool and translated. I've allowed essentially an extra 6 months in this planning, and that is really to account for project delays and staffing changes, and essentially to try and map out something that which hopefully we can better, or is at least very realistic. You'll see a small dip in the number of projects delivered towards the end. So again, this is only based on the current resourcing. We've made a commitment to relook at this in 2024, or we'd like to make that commitment. You'll see a small dip at the end where essentially it looks like we would basically have 3 projects: utilities and renewable energy being together, forestry and metal processing. The reason for that is basically because we'd be coming off the end of banks, insurance, and capital markets. And because this is 3 sector standards with very high interest level, I'm predicting that we're going to need the project team to have a bit of a longer sort of tail end to that project in order to facilitate external launch, promotional work, and also the work that needs to happen internally. So I've just left them unallocated, but we can come back to that closer to the time. I think we can move to what is in fact my last slide. Perfect. In addition to this sort of fairly structured plan to move through the list, there's a couple of other things that we would like to include in the work program. The first is the design and testing of an update process following the completion of topic standards. As you know, the GRI standards list disclosures, both GRI and non-GRI, but primarily disclosures from topic standards. And this is, of course, one of our key principles to have these interlinkages and these interconnections, and to ensure wherever possible we're limiting the creation of new metrics. But the side effect, of course, is that if a topic standard is updated, then those updates need to flow into sector standards. I have a little bit of time to discuss this tomorrow, and I would certainly like to hear your thoughts. But I suppose the more that we contemplate what this process looks like, the more complicated it reveals itself to be in terms of technical updates, but also complying with the due process protocol and the principles of stakeholder and expert input. So we need to now, with the planned publication of the revised GRI 304 biodiversity sometime next year, hopefully, we need to establish this process in the first half of next year, and it's only going to grow in scale and complexity. I'm already predicting that we're going to need a dedicated team of people to execute these updates. So that's on the planning as well. In addition, we're proposing to undertake a research project on the public sector next year. Later today, I think on the agenda, we have speakers from GSSB, so from the public sector standard setting body who've been looking at the financial standards and who we've had some contact with. Once again, the GSSB has previously raised questions about how the public sector features in our sector list. And as you might remember, currently, any sector standard can be used by a public or a private organisation, as long as the activities they're doing fall within that scope. But no, there is no sector listed that sort of contemplates the unique features or the unique activities of the public sector. So that's one of the things that we want to look at, how that would be structured, if there's something missing. So that's the proposal to do that in 2023. We haven't yet proposed to put that on the list because we want to make sure that it makes sense structurally. And then finally, I've already mentioned this, but in 2024, we would assess our potential to move into Group 2 during this work program phase. Early 2024 was the commitment I made to Bastian. So maybe late 2023, we could start talking about this. And that is in fact the end of my presentation. So there's an opportunity here for some clarification questions. We'll have more time at the end to discuss the whole work program, but anything that I've sort of presented that doesn't make sense or you would like to ask more questions on.
Any discussion from the GSSB at this point? Yes, go ahead, Julia.
Only to support the work together of utilities and renewable energy, because it's a real important point for a utility like us, for example. And I am a little bit scared, if I may, to have the final work at the end of 2025, because we have to work on that right now. Utility sector is identified one of the first sector of the taxonomy, for example, that have to work on the climate change. So I understand totally the resource constraint, the timing that we need, etc., etc. It's only to raise this kind of point because all the utility are working right now on this kind of KPIs, and internally it's not too easy to work again year by year on this kind of thing. So I don't know if it's possible to have for this kind of work different moment for different topic of this kind of sectors. So for example, you mentioned before biodiversity, that is something that is really important. I don't know if at the same time we can give some advice for this kind of sector on this one. So it's a strange thing, I know, because normally you complete all the sector and then you present. But I don't know if it's possible to think if it could be an option in order to avoid this kind of reworking inside the company. But for me, the program is absolutely perfect.
Thanks, Julia. I've got Robin.
Yeah, just two quick questions. One was the overall work program. I'm assuming it's sort of based on existing resource or known resources going forward at this point. And if additional resources come online, then other things can be sort of fast-tracked or brought forward, I gather. I have some other questions specific to the sector piece, but my second question was really on the number of moving parts that might be in play in terms of recommendations from a sector working group that have implications for a topic specific standard. And we've seen that already with one topic specific standard spills over into, another. I'm just wondering generally what's the thinking around sort of some sort of contingency for that kind of work, because it's hard to quantify, I guess, at this point. And it may be too much detail to go into for the work program at this point as well.
Do you want to take those, Mia?
Yes, of course. Thank you. In terms of, maybe if I start with Julia, in terms of the utilities and renewable energy, I hear you. Of course, we would like to start everything tomorrow. That would be ideal. I think in terms of advice on for particular sectors on certain topics, we haven't contemplated that, but that's certainly something that we could discuss. We don't currently, if I'm very transparent about it, we don't currently have a mechanism by which to do that unless you have somebody from that sector on a topic standards working group, that might sort of be able to filter that through. But certainly we can have a look at whether it's possible to accelerate those sectors a little bit, perhaps given the importance and given that the climate change work will be going on. That's the other thing too, of course, we're going to, I don't want to preempt Harold's presentation, but, you know, we're going to have this climate work. So then there's also a balance, which comes back to your question of when do you wait a little, you know, to see the sort of direction of that? Do you get started? So we are, you know, these are things I think that we're going to have to manage on an ongoing basis. So I would like to have a think about your question a little bit more, but Robin, to come back to you. So just to answer first in terms of resourcing, it's a little bit of a middle road, I would say. So what this is based on is existing planning for the team, but we don't have all of those positions filled. So for example, in the sector team, we currently have 9 approved positions ranging from team assistant, not including me, ranging from team assistant to senior manager. And we have 6 of those filled. So we have space to recruit another 3 in the very short term. Plus I've earmarked some additional resources for this update process, which has just become clear. I think you can't do as an extra, it needs some dedicated work. So, so it's sort of we have our eye on this structure, but it's not currently filled. And that's why we want to make the commitment of seeing with all these positions, how does the team hold together? How many things do we have going on at once? And then we would look at, can we expand it again? Because we haven't actually got up to that size yet. And the second question was about the moving parts, I think. Yeah, Robin, I mean, it definitely is something that keeps me up at night. I think we have some workable solutions, but there's no doubt that we have to do more work to really put in place a workable system. And I don't think we can get away from the need to do a bit of a, you know, each context will need to be reconsidered, because there are, I mean, the nicest thing would be Harold says, I can update all the topic standards tomorrow and then you can start your program. But you know that. So I think we are just going to have to keep a really sort of keen and regular eye on this. And I imagine that once the team is established, this will be a large part of what I have to think about on a daily basis. And so we're testing things, just to one more comment, we're testing things. So for example, with the mining sector standard, which will go out for public comment just after biodiversity is released for public comment, given if you approve it. What we will test is including basically the extract of the public exposure that was for biodiversity in the mining public exposure. So we're trying to test a few different things to see what leads us to the best possible place. Yeah.
Just wanted to add to Mia's comments on current capacity, and that holds for Mia's team, but actually across the standards division. So we're for the first time in a situation that we have the financial means to bring on board the talent in principle, right? Where we can hire people to the level that we can support what we're putting in front of you. In the past, we had work programs that were very ambitious, and the financial situation didn't allow to hire against that. Having said that, we are also in a situation where this year we have spent a considerable time in the leadership team of the standards division on hiring, and we didn't succeed. And that has to do with some of the proposition, the way we are nowadays competing for talent, but it also has to do with a certain scarcity of the personnel and the profiles that we're looking for, and more competition also on that front. We're not competing necessarily with for-profit entities for standard setting personnel, but for people with deep knowledge in standard setting plus ESG/sustainability. There are, of course, very many use cases nowadays. We will have to institutionally get better at bringing the talent on board more swiftly. That is actually one of the crucial elements of that scaling exercise overall. And I think the more swiftly we can bring talent into the team, the quicker we can also reevaluate and consider whether or not to further scale activities. But given that challenge around bringing talent to GRI, I think this is still very ambitious what Bia is outlining here. Just for the next year, everything needs to fall in place very nicely in terms of having the new colleagues, bringing them right into projects and getting to that level of ambition. Yeah.
Anna.
Question, Mia, probably for you and for Bastian. Since the shortage of personnel is a real deal, and you, Mia, on your slide, you had a lot of time dedicated to research, of course. Have you tried working with academic institutions, with perhaps Dutch universities or anywhere else in the world to see if you can, would it be possible to outsource some of the research, and perhaps Ken has an opinion on that as well? Could students help? And maybe that could be a beginning of a longer term relationship where you could eventually hire people who work on this research project.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. We haven't, and primarily, well, I'm not sure if Miguel is online. I think he's in another meeting, but our head of research will be online tomorrow in the sector program session and hopefully later this afternoon. So he might also have some comments on that. But primarily because up until the beginning of this year, we were still focused on how a sector standard looked and felt and would be developed. So we really only just come to the point of codifying our development process, solidifying this is the work that we do to get to a high quality sector standard. So I would say that, you know, at the moment, we're currently sort of completing a lot of our internal guidance. And so at the end of this year, I think we're more ready to contemplate other formats in terms of delivery. So for the financial services project proposal, we did use an external consultant who was more familiar with those sectors to help us accelerate the background piece. So that's something that we tested this time. And I imagine there'll be other sectors where we'll need to definitely do that, whether it's academic partnership or consultancies. And so I think this is the sort of thing that we definitely need to think about. The other thing we're thinking about, of course, is can you deliver the projects now that you've sort of got a base, what else can you do? So the financial sectors where they've got some commonality, we're going to try and deliver it as a single project, will be a test to see, was that indeed faster or did it somehow slow us down? And, you know, so yeah, absolutely open to as many of these ideas as we can get. But I think up until now, we've really just been trying to work out what's our sort of baseline delivery model. Right.
And, oh, sorry, yes, go ahead, Kent, yes.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity to work with academics. Of course, what academics are always looking for is grant funding. And so it has something to do with the financial resources of GRI. But you know, it's certainly possible to develop specific topics and then you know, put out applications for grant funding, and you would get a lot of interest in it, but it has to be targeted. But you have to have a bit of money behind it.
Anyone else? Joseph.
Yeah, just a very overarching question on the strategy. We are trying to say GSSB will ensure that its standard setting activities are organized to achieve tangible and practical convergence of all leading standards, frameworks, and similar initiatives. That's a very overarching statement. Do we have a process to see which are the leading standards we are getting aligned or we want to influence? Because I see a explosion of standards and activities, you know, in different fields. So I think it will be useful to draw a borderline or a baseline or a kind of boundary where we are actually working, so that now our work will be highlighted as well as connected with some of the standards that are emerging.
Yeah, I think we'll have a discussion specifically on that alignment with other standards later. But the point about seeing the emergence of more powerful other parties in the space. That's one, but also more regulatory activity. That's the global standard setting. And then more regulatory activity locally, whether that's regions or country level. I think that necessitates what you're suggesting, that we actually screen through and decide where we want to focus. Certainly from a standards alignment perspective, there is another element to it that is more with the GRI Secretariat overall, which pertains to advocacy with regulators and all of that, to less extent changing our standards in line with developments. It has more to do with ensuring that our standards form part of regulatory endeavors. So that's the second component. But we want to tease out more as part of the work program what we can commit to publicly already in terms of players that we want to collaborate with. And a couple of names are already in the work program. We have a couple of external presentations during the meeting today and tomorrow. And your idea for process to have a continuous screening of developments is certainly something we can look at. I would just reflect on, there was a time maybe 3-4 years ago where GI would happily trail with any development on any level and endorse it and try to attend to it. We're past the point. I think there are more requests now than we can possibly really attend to. So there's a structural issue that we need to sort out. We don't want to let stakeholders down. We don't want to disappoint, but we will probably have to and use our resources strategically. But from a standard setting perspective, it's also important to look at how can we impact many of these regulatory initiatives through working with the right parties. And what we have, of course, was the collaboration with EFRAG, ISSB. Mia mentioned the public sector work of the International Public Sector Standards Board. These are the types of things that we need to consider now, because through this we can impact many of the more regional or country level developments.
Any other? Sorry, yes, Jennifer. Yeah.
And Mia, I wonder if you could summarize, we're coming out of the pilot sector standards. What have you learned about what the sector standards should look like, or how they should be developed, that you're incorporating as we move into this next set?
Thank you for that question. I have to, yeah. Well, I think a lot of, so one was about the design of the standard itself. And obviously we needed to establish a large portion of that as part of the release of the universal standard. So obviously thinking a lot about what's required when you're reporting using a sector standard. I think very much what we settled in terms of that design was this very strong connection between the sector standards and the topic standards. And that has, I think that is absolutely the right underpinning principle, but it presents a number of very interesting challenges. So we spend a lot of time discussing, for example, if we want to include this additional sector disclosure, is it really unique for this sector? Should it feature in the recommendations to the GSSB? Should it feature in the sector standard? So there's a lot of work that goes on sort of discussing the integrated nature of this system. Even things like, if in the mining project at the moment, we had previously established this topic, which was focused on conflict and security practices together. And now in the mining project, they want to split these two things up into individual topics. Now that takes a sort of an extraordinary amount of time to establish, is that the right thing to do? What would it mean for the management approach reporting? What would it mean for our system? What does it mean for topic standards? So there's a lot of work that's now being established in terms of the cohesion of the system itself and where we need to make things stay the same, where they can vary. The other thing is that we've done, which is something that's broader than the sector program, it's also relevant for the work that Harold's team is doing, is split up some of the expertise. So the change in the standards division to bring in an editorial and publishing function, and also to have a research team, has meant that we used to say, here's a project, here's a couple of people doing that project. Now get on and sort of do it. And now we have a much more sort of structured and professional way of managing those projects to say, this person with this expertise comes in at this time. So that's also taken us a long time to establish how many times should the working group review a draft that's 70 pages? How many times should it come to the GSSB? How many times should it be internally reviewed? So it's quite sort of micro detail that we've really contemplated and built into a sort of process framework, which, by the way, has enough flexibility to always be changed per project, but we wanted to come up with a sort of basic set of procedures, I suppose, and a framework to govern that. So
just to add one thing I think that is important for in light of the work program discussion as well. Despite our best efforts, I think we were also not able to establish something that would render a sector standard that actually has the potential to do what we envision it to do, to help with the materiality assessment and guide companies in a specific sector in being transparent on all their impacts, and develop these sector standards in 2 or 3 months, right? We know that these things take 24 months. We've established that, and I think in the market that is also important, and that we say that these things take time and we need to take the necessary time, despite all the claims that this can sometimes be done faster. A lot of the work that is happening now on sector level is actually building on our work, right? And to stand up original work for a particular sector with an impact framing, that will take time. We will always look to speed things up where possible. One parameter is the due process that induces certain framing from a time perspective, but it is also just the work that needs to be done, and that needs to be very solid. We want to have the multi-stakeholder representation, the expertise in getting to consensus on these things, and so when we look at the overall ambition and the timeline and window of 3 years and what you can accomplish, I think that's for us also an important learning from the pilots, that there is, it just takes a certain number of months, a certain number of years actually to bring these things about, and we have to be comfortable with that in a way. The traction that the 3 pilot standards that we have, the first 3 sector standards are getting, showed, and all the interactions that we have, it's all anecdotally, of course, until now, but they show that people really see how this is helpful to their practice, and so they're really good signals that this is addressing part of the gap that we had identified in our offering. We need to hold on to this, and I think for the GSB and GRI to defend that approach, that we invest the necessary time is very important.
Any further discussion? Shall we move on then further in the presentation?
Next one, please. Yeah. Yeah, so we follow the elements in the discussion paper. So from sector is 1. After our pilots now, we're having the full program. And we also have, go to the next one, please. We have a set of standards. And actually the GSSB is committed to maintain this, to make sure it's up to date, it's relevant. The last couple of weeks or months, even people asked me, is the idea or the aim to make as many standards as possible? I said, no, that's not the idea. The idea is to make sure that all topics and disclosures are there, which are needed by the users and now in the complexity with the new universal ones, with the sector ones, the liking material ones. And if you have them, then do you have your disclosures there? So yeah, the next. So this means that we have to elevate the revision work. I would say the review and revision, but basically that will lead into revision of many of the topic standards we have. Basically, I came in about a year ago and we started together with Elodie on a biodiversity one. So this is ongoing, but the plan is by the end of 2025 that at least all topic standards are revised or at least under revision, so ongoing. And this is an ambition, has of course a lot of implications, as several people already mentioned it. Complexity of a lot of projects in parallel, not only the topic ones, not only the revisions, but also new topics probably, because there is more need in the market for certain topics, but also with the sector ones. And we just touched upon a little bit this interference, so this updating of the sector ones compared to the new topic ones. So this is all. This will lead us to a lot of questions, and process-wise, training-wise, tool-wise. So everything we need in the next months, and especially through next year, should lead us to this ambition. 3 projects at the end of 2023, and it will go to at least 10 revision projects at the end of 2025. And just to give it an idea, again, if we want to make a real GRI standard, so with your multi-stakeholder process, with this also with this commitment, also with the consensus-based approach, yeah, we will have approximately also 24 months, because otherwise I don't call it a standard, based on my experience as standardizer. So you have to take that into account. You cannot go faster. If you want to, you have another deliverable. Also a possibility, but then maybe we call it regulation or something. Let's go to next. So it's ambitious, but we're already starting to framing, I would say, the 2023 year plan, because the work's ongoing now, just started, and the climate one, which we expect to send you the draft proposal for in December. All this together is basically already 90%, 95% of what we are able to do next year. Even if I hire a lot of people, I still have to train them. So just to be aware. So on the one hand, you could say it's difficult. On the other hand, it's also very clear for next year, but it gives us lead time, at least to grow, train people, and to start more projects in 2024 to 2025. So biodiversity, we expect to have the PCP in December. Labor, well, you were all part of it, so ambitious program. It's not only a standards project, but it's really a lot of standards influenced, involved, and also to be decided in there. Already in the first meeting, we had discussions that non-discrimination and supplier social assessment should also be in there, being researched. So this is ongoing, and the first PCP expected to have at least in 2023. Climate change, again, more than one standard, with some splits in there. So the disclosure 2 related to climate of 201 economic performance is part of that, part of the project. And this already feeds into other questions like, okay, if we're going to deal with one disclosure, what happens with the other one? Are the people in the climate group already able to cover it? Same for the 2021 for labor. So it's nice to take on the disclosure 2021, but what about the rest? So we also thought about that. So from priority perspective, my proposal would be to take them pretty soon on board. So the economic ones, economic impact ones, just to make sure that we keep some alignment in our topic program. But this will feed in all of this in next year. I said we have some lead time, some start time. Next year we will only have the publication of 304, and the top one, around I expect just around summer 2023. Of course, this is a lot of traffic around this. We see it already now, also in preparation of our PCP, with the COPs in Egypt, COPs in Montreal. A lot of interest in biodiversity in relation to nature, in relation to climate, and also the climate one. When we started, there was, and even the labor one. These are all pretty heavy topics which have a lot of interest in traffic. So that's good to see. Let's go to the next. And I had the critical incident management. Yeah, this was one of the ones where we had one disclosure which was not covered in one of the revisions, and we definitely have to take this on because you already mentioned this several times and it was already prioritized. So how will this look like? You see here again all the standards, the one we published recently, at least in a review cycle 303, 403, 207, 306. my opinion, we do not have to review them before in this next work program. Can debate it, but we have already enough challenges. So my proposal would be then at the end of 2025 or 2026, you start reviewing and see what's at stake for these. As I said, ongoing revisions all feed into next year, and then there is place for at least one or two projects. Due to the nature of the ongoing revisions or the one we will start, so I very strongly suggest also in the discussion paper to have 201, 202, and 203. I'll call them the impacts one, economic impacts one, to have it under revision. And then we have room in the spills and leaks, which is really at the bottom. And then we have probably room for also starting one new topic. That's good, I think, for the ambition also from the GSSB to make sure that we also have a new topic. I mean, something like with tax, really, or all the presentations we got this year. Some of the presentations from stakeholders were more related to disclosures, which are somehow already in our topic standards, but some of them were really new, which we don't cover in our system. So that I think that's this. So this gives an overview. Let's go to the next. So as I said, so spills and leaks, I would say, we have to take this on. So my idea is we have now people still trying to find new people. If we have educated them, one of the new guys or girls will start with spills and leaks. And Matthew, he's now very heavily involved. Matthew Dunn very heavily involved in the biodiversity standard, but he will be leading the economic impacts, if you agree upon that, of course, after the discussion. Next one. So I touched several issues, how I came to a kind of proposal, how the standards division came to a kind of priority in only the revision of our current standards. So we're not talking about new ones or others, and the revision of the current group of topic standards. So the biodiversity, because it's ongoing, labor, climate, spills and leaks, economic ones I had. And then, of course, we have other ones, which all should start, like the discussion with utilities and energy, should start tomorrow or yesterday, but we have to find reasons why something should start in early 2024 or 2025. I did this based on, and we come to that in the next session. So we got feedback from the working groups. We have feedback from other previous public consultations. We have feedback, of course, from the stakeholder input, early stakeholder input in the presentations. And we will get more input during the PCP, at least pretty sure. But based on all the inputs we have now, there was this, the inputs on the need for indigenous people, security practice, and the security practice was typically on the presentation, one of the presentations we got. Also indigenous people and local communities about the wages, living wages, that will also be covered in labor, but probably also something FPIC. There is a need, also strong recommendation by the sector program. So based on that, I came to this, and together with Standards Division, we came to this kind of proposition where we say, well, in 2024, these are prioritized. In 2025, the proposals for the next group will come. And it's a tough decision because we have to take decisions here, what to prioritize, what to start. But this is at least the first step forward. Maybe go to the next.
Michel, if you'd like to come in with a question before we move on.
No, it's a very rapid comment. In spills and leaks, you should add GRI 305 emissions also, because you may have that situation too.
Make it more ambitious. That's good. Yeah, that's true. But it's true. It's true. Yeah. Thank you.
Another, Harold, if you see procurement, nowadays the new due diligence requirement, mainly by the regulator or in general, led by the company on supplier code of conduct, it is going to be integrated process. They talk about not only social aspect of assessment of the supply chain, but environmental governance. So we have an opportunity to combine these two, 308 and 414, and make it more holistic as a supplier due diligence program. Number one. Another thing, what we observed in recent past, the diversity and inclusion is getting more prominence as a key performance indicator. So somewhat direct reference to diversity and inclusion, we have a touching topic like non-discrimination, which is an enabler sort of a thing, but that does not really lead to the performance challenges or requirement to diversity and inclusion. So it would be a good idea to consider as a thought now to develop a topic standards.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think I take the comments into consideration now. I think it's good to keep it at least for the moment to for the discussion.
Yeah, another, because Peter is with us, and especially some of the metal sector, the LME, London Metal Exchange, is driving these responsible sourcing, and OECD, what we start feeling that OECD alignment with different standard setting body is a new phenomena nowadays. So most of because OECD has been undoubtedly recognized as a most referred standard as far as due diligence is concerned, especially when it comes to the conflict affected area, or the free, prior and informed consent, indigenous people, especially the infra sector. So think we need to give a thought that how exactly can we make direct reference to OECD as part of our topic standard, or we can pick up some relevant phrases out of it, fit into our different topic standards.
I was just discussing, so we did this question we had several times already, so how to capture that. So I think
because
maybe also park it for the additional considerations part.
Because this is a new development in the market, and we should be sensitive to respond to it and see how does it matter to us as the GRI.
Yeah. At least how to deal with it and agree, whether it's in additional documents, whether it's in a topic, whether it's in something else. Mia?
Thank you.
So, Julia, do you want to come in with a question?
Yes, only two things. I haven't any concern in terms of timing, but I have some doubt in terms of the content of two topics. One is digitalization, and the second one is circular economy. So I don't totally agree that the only one GRI that are impacted are GRI 418 for digitalization and the two for circular economy, because both are real connected with the general structure of the company, are driver on change, and so are a little bit more complex, respect customers for digitalization and waste and materials for circularity. So I don't know, because we have time, because we have 1 year and 2 years, in order to see if it's possible to update other GRI in order to consider all the aspects of digitalization and circular economy.
Yeah, so this was a little bit a trick. So here it says digitalization, but the idea is because the 418 is a revision. So we're talking about revisions here to include it in a new topic of digitalization. So at the next topic on new topics, then the digitalization aspects comes in, and this needs research. But the idea is at least that feeds in to digitalization as one aspect. Again, we have to agree, of course, on which new topic to take on. Mia, you had a...
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment in relation to the OECD due diligence. So there's obviously a set of, I think, 6 sector-based due diligence guidance. And I just wanted to flag that we are on a fairly frequent basis at the moment, a weekly basis, in contact with those who are working on those sector-based guidances to try and establish how that should be reflected in the sector standards. So in mining, for example, when you look at the conflict minerals, we're working very hard to see what elements need to be reflected over and above what's already in the universal. So they also have this dual tier thing going on in the OECD, where they now have the generic or their broad due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, and then they have these sector-based guidances, some of which were established before and some which are after, and they're going through their own alignment process. So for mining, for example, we have reflected it in certain elements. So for example, in the conflict topic, you'll see a lot of reliance, of course, on that due diligence, but we're working with them to identify where the commonality is between what we've already got in universal and what needs to be included in a sector-based standard. Don't think we've completely got that right yet, but we're certainly working closely with the OECD and the due diligence unit in the OECD to try and do this in the best way.
Thank you. And thank you for all the input. I think this is helpful for the next steps. I have one slide also just to show in the same way as we did for the sector team. And don't look at the new ones because the new topics we didn't touch upon yet. So, but in the entire sequence chart overview way of looking at it. So last year we started with one manager and me. Now we're with 4. The end of this year, we hope at least to be with 5 or 6 standards managers, and then we will be able to at least have the projected project for 2023 starting and ongoing. And in the end, in 2025, we will have about 10 revisions projects ongoing, as I said. So this means we have to educate the people, we have the tools there. You need to have the capability to do good stakeholder management, consensus creating in your working group or TC, and also have a bit of knowledge from the background. So this is really challenging, but we think with this space we're able to do it. And here in red you see pretty nice where the focus is. So the red ones are the publications. So it's really speeding up to 2024, 2025. If you compare the ones from sector, you see a lot of publications around this time. So this has a huge effect on the rest of the organization, but also, for instance, on the team of Laura, how to manage this and how to. We never did it before, so that's. So 2023 we need time. You can see it's only publication of the biodiversity one, H2, second half of 2023, and if all goes well, we have the PCP for the labor. So we have time to train people, have the processes in time, and of course keep on going with the ongoing projects. That's at least the idea for the topics team. Yes, I think now it's time for additional questions for clarification.
Looks like Corley's got her hand up. Corley, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Judy, and thank you, Harold, also, and Mia, for that overview. It's very exciting to see what you have in mind. A lot of work, though. Just a quick question, and please do tell me if this is. I'm assuming it might be discussed, but if it's going to be in another session, please advise. But I was just wondering, in terms of the collaboration with the ISSB, and particularly around the alignment of work programs, as my understanding goes, is that something that has been considered here, or what is the discussion with them, particularly around climate change, which I understand is one of the kind of the first standards that will be coming out from the ISSB. How is the GRI process being aligned with what's happening on that side? And again, if this is part of another session's discussion, I'm happy to wait, but I just wanted to throw that into the mix for now.
So just a quick note about this. Other than climate, there is no clarity on the agenda of the ISB going forward on where they will focus next. That is also a reason that we invited the leadership of the ISB for later today to present their expectations towards you as the counterpart in this collaboration. I think I would say there is an opportunity here to actually align both for sector related work as well as for topic related work on our end, with their agendas. And the good thing, the opportunity here is that the ISSB, other than the commitment and climate, everything else will go through an agenda consultation, as they call it as well. And that is coinciding with ours. So if there is opportunity to collaborate, we can actually develop also our public consultation moment, and then the finalization of our work programs in lockstep. That is something that they are committed to do as well. The one thing I would say in recent conversations, Judy and I have focused on also highlighting contents that we have established already as basis for collaboration. So if you look at the water, the occupational health and safety standard, these are at least likely choices in the short to medium term for the ISB topics that they will have to cover. And we have done the legwork already on the impact side, so it would be relatively easy to extend that out. It doesn't have to be standing up joint projects that commence and start to review a subject now at the beginning. It could also be building on contents that we have worked on since 2016 in the standards, and more importantly, the modular format. But we will revisit this based also on the inputs that we're hearing later today, Corley.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Bastian.
Anna.
My question is for Harold or perhaps Laura. As you guys going through the review of the existing standards, what keeps sort of bothering me is that the naming of some of the standards, because it's old, but I keep hearing Elko talking about the impact reporting more than sustainability reporting. Is there a part of the work stream also to start renaming some of the topics? Like I look at procurement practices and I think like, you know, who cares? Should we be talking more about the impacts? But is that a part of the work stream?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, definitely. I think as part of any revision project, the title of the standards are also subject to review based on the feedback from the experts on the working group and also feedback from the public comment. So I believe that prior to any project to update or create a new topic standard, there'll be research that looks into the scope of that project, which will also influence the title of the different standards that fall under that project. But we are aware that some of the current titles of the standards are not clear based on feedback from the users, and we're taking that into account in the future revision of the projects.
Any others? Michel.
Yes, perhaps again a rapid comment. What I can at least testify for the new members here is that each time a standard has been revised in the last 3 years, value chain impacts was one of the topics that was addressed. So it was the case for waste, it's the case for biodiversity, it's the case for all the specific standards. Where we are more in your field, Harold, is when we talk about community impacts. And then it's not just economic impact, it's also social and environmental impacts that may happen there. There, it's a bit still a void, and so probably needs to be addressed in a specific way.
Harold, do you want to respond to any of this?
No, I would like to thank for the good comments, and I just note them down. And again, so this is really a starting point where we started. Also, like with the titles, we have a lot of feedback, and we try, of course, to bring this to a next level, also for the PCP, and then also with your guidance to come to a very ambitious but also realistic, comprehensive, good set of standards. I think that's what we all would like to achieve. So that's. Absolutely. So no, thank you for the comments.
Yeah, I think you know, not to necessarily rehash old territory here, but I think some members might recall that in the transition from the G4 guidelines to standards, we considered eliminating the distinct categories of environmental, economic, and social. because of exactly this kind of interrelationship, and everything bounces off of everything else. And this is one of the big challenges of working in the sustainability field, is that it is basically everything. And it's very hard to segment things into very neat kind of tidy categories. And I think it's inevitable that over time we will find it will continue to sort of circle back on itself, and we'll find new ways to expand the understanding of existing and new contents. Okay. I think we are just at we're on track with the agenda right now, and I think we are just about at the lunch break for those of us here. Is there anything else to cover before we go into the lunch break? Are you right? Okay, well, we have 1 hour and 5 minutes then until we go back into the public session, and we will be joined by James Farrer from Worker Info Exchange with an external presentation for our discussion at that point. And until then, we will close the live stream, or pause the live stream anyway, and we will rejoin in just about an hour. Thank you. Hello, welcome back. We have just come off a lunch break here in Amsterdam, and to open up our afternoon session, as you know, we are joined now by James Farrer from Worker Info Exchange, who's going to be talking to us in the next 45 minutes about algorithm transparency and GRI standards, following which we have an unused slot in the agenda. And as I mentioned this morning, what we'll do at that point is pause the live stream again and use that time for further private session to talk about some administrative issues before we go into the rest of the agenda. Can we move the slide deck forward, or what are we doing with the presentation at this point, please? James, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yes, I'm here. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we're having a little bit of difficulty with your slide deck, and it may be that you are asked to present from your end,
okay.
to be a presenter, which I think is being designated now.
Okay, let me see that I can do that. Hopefully you can.
Yeah. We see your slide deck here.
Fantastic.
I'll just hand it over to you then, James, to talk us through this.
Well, thank you, Judy, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope you've had a good lunch there in Amsterdam. I'm going to have mine after this. Well, thank you for taking the time to put this on the agenda. I think it's a very important topic, the gig economy, but particularly the harmful nature of algorithmic management and what that is doing to work, to the future of work. And in many ways, what's happening in the gig economy is really canary in the coal mine situation, in that a lot of the things that we're seeing being tried out in the gig economy in terms of future of work will become and are becoming the future of work for many, many more people. So it's very important to keep an eye on what's happening here, because it is normalizing things that perhaps we should think more carefully about. Before I move on, I just want to give you an idea of the type of surveillance economy that the gig economy is. This slide here is a visualization of every GPS movement I made in the short while that I worked as an Uber driver myself, which I always find fascinating that there is this level of tracking going on. And of course, this is just surface level, but it gives you a sense of the intensity of algorithmic surveillance that's happening to workers every single day, and the power of that. So what is the gig economy? Well, the gig economy in a way is a big lie. There's no gig. The use of language is very harmful in a way in the gig economy. The idea of calling something a gig rather than a job, this is language to casualize employment. It's a very deliberate ploy, and I've put in the appendix, just for your own viewing, some of the ways that language is misused. Onboarding, for example, instead of recruitment. An economic opportunity to earn is what's a job. And even still today, that's the language that Uber uses. In fact, if you look at Dara Khosrowshahi, the CEO of Uber, he was in Australia last week, and he talked about speaking to earners rather than workers or employees for that matter. But language is really important, and it's funny how it begins to reframe what a job is. The whole idea of a gig is that it's a side hustle, it is extra income, it's gravy, and therefore you should trade away rights, statutory protections that you ought to have in any form of employment. But that's the subtle deal that's going on. But the reality is, for most gig workers, it is a full-time job, it is full-time work, and it deserves to have full-time protections. But that's the subtle game that's happening here by calling something a gig. Something that maybe jobbing actors or soccer moms are doing on the side, but it's not really serious employment. We do those workers a disservice to accept that type of language. But what are the characteristics and dimensions of this in the EU? Well, 28 million people are doing this type of work at the moment in the EU. That's expected to expand by 2025 to 43 million people. Revenues in 2016 were 3 billion, that had jumped to 14 billion by 2020. Probably on the ride share, it took a dip in 20 and 21, but that's come roaring back. And of course, delivery really took off during the pandemic. Unfortunately, 97% of workers on the platform are not making, of these platforms are not making national insurance contributions or pension contributions. So we have a pension time bomb with this type of work about to go off, but also we have serious social protection problems in terms of people not having access to sick pay or other social protections. Often the harm here is that people are wrongly classified as self-employed. A lot of the work is insecure piecework pay, so insecurity in having access to that work, and then insecurity in the pay that you would be offered. And of course, it's all piecework rather than hourly rates. There are none or few statutory protections in employment for this type of work, that's completely sidestepped. 55% are earning less than the minimum wage of this work, and of course lack of social protection, which puts the individuals at risk, but it also is harmful for society because those social protections often have to be picked up by other people in the end. So where are we at the moment? What happened with this type of misclassification that's endemic in the gig economy is that these employers relied on contracts. They relied on contracts that you would agree that you're self-employed, you would agree that the company's only acting as an agent, and you would agree to all of this sort of fictitious reality that's created in a contract. The courts have ruled basically everywhere two things. Number one, it is the facts of how you work that are more important than what the contract says. It's the primacy of facts. We've seen this in Europe, we've seen this in the UK. So it matters not how they've described it, but how it really is. And the evidence really counts for that. The second bit that's really important is that it's the statute book trumps these contracts. That's the message of the Supreme Court ruling in the UK. So these protections that you're entitled to under the statute book will always trump these fictitious contracts. And so these words, fictitious, artificial, faintly ridiculous, these are not my words. These are words of rulings in the United Kingdom, the Employment Tribunal, the Court of Appeal, and the Supreme Court as well, to describe these abusive contracts as fictitious, artificial, and faintly ridiculous. But where do we go now? If these contracts are not going to uphold the misclassification that these companies are looking for, I believe the next wave of misclassification is algorithmic control. Because if you go back to number one of what I talked about before, which is, the two things that have come out of this is the primacy of facts and the primacy of statute book over contract. Well, if we go to primacy of facts, you end up in this conundrum that if we're going to now conceal management control in algorithms that are opaque, where am I going to find the facts to present as evidence to show that I'm really employed, I'm really in an employment relationship? This is the conundrum that many gig workers are now beginning to find, because a lot of the management control is on set and it's in algorithmic control. And our job now is to try and work in for exchange is to try and reveal that as much as possible so that workers can assert the rights that they're entitled to. So what are the aspects of algorithmic control that we're really concerned about? Well, we're concerned about work allocation, how work is assigned to people, how people might be performance managed, and how people, including dismissals, including hiring, also how people are surveilled at work. Those are the aspects of algorithmic management that we're really concerned about. And I want to just say one thing about algorithmic management. You know, an algorithm is a really unfortunate term. It's really alienating language. Again, the theme here with the gig economy is misuse of language. But algorithmic management, what is an algorithm? It's simply an instruction. It is simply an expression of management will. It's simply an order, if you like. And so we have to say that algorithmic management is just that, management. That's what it is, management of workers. And the mistake, what the platforms want you to think, is that somehow algorithmic management sits apart from management and from the workers, almost like a third party. But that's not the case. Algorithmic management is management. That's all it is. It's just expressed in an automated way, but it's still management, and management are responsible and accountable for it. So to give you an idea of what the battleground for access and for explanation we're looking for, it goes to the personal data that's being processed by these platforms as we work. And so what we're trying to understand across this sort of step case, the stairs of an intellectual battleground in a way we're having is, at the lowest level, is the data that we enter into the machine ourselves, you know, our name, our address, our license details, insurance details, and so on. There's very little dispute about this. I gave you that data. I know you have it. Please let me have it back. Let me see how you're using it. Green box, not much dispute about that. And then in this amber zone is the data observed by the machine about us. That's the telematics, your braking, acceleration, movement, your GPS records, all of that stuff. Now, we know that that type of data is being collected and processed about us. Not mad keen about giving it back to us, but very little dispute that it's there. And then the real battleground is this red box, this inference data. Now that the machine has accepted the data I've given it, observed me at work by creating their own data, what have they inferred about me at work? How is that data then being used to profile me? And profiling is really important because it is profiles that drive further automated decision-making related to the three things we just discussed: work allocation, performance management, surveillance. This is a real red zone. This is an area that is hotly contested. We are entitled to access to this data in most jurisdictions. In Europe, under the GDPR. The GDPR has often been exported to many other jurisdictions in the global south. And then in the US, we're starting to see more data protection, similar data protection regimes popping up there, like the California Consumer Privacy Act, and I believe there's a federal bill now being proposed also. So this type of data is really important because it drives that profiling that then is used to manage you, and it's very important to get some transparency about that. The platforms will also argue that this is their intellectual property. And so there is some battleground between their intellectual property rights and the rights of the worker to understand how they've been managed at work and if they have been. So what are the harms? So I'm going to focus on algorithmic harms for now, although there is some crossover, because I think the gig economy is well covered We only have 20 minutes anyway, so we can't cover the whole thing. We've been talking about it and working in this area for years. So we don't have the time to cover all this now, but I will try to focus on some of the algorithmic issues that are really important in our view. So first off is about pay. Now, it used to be that pay for delivery workers and for drivers, passenger drivers, was set by time and distance. That's the way taxi meters have worked for generations. And that's the way Uber and others set out at the beginning, is they would meter time and distance in the cloud and generate a fare. That fare would be a per mile, per kilometer, and per minute. Both of those would be put together. So you'd have time and distance put together in a fare that both the passenger, the platform, and the drivers could understand. And then from that, the platform would take a percentage commission. So everything was relatively straightforward and transparent. All sides understood what the basis of pay and price were. What the platforms have now moved towards is dynamic pay rate setting. So what's dynamic pay? What's dynamic pricing? It's algorithmically driven pricing. It's they're now telling us that it's no longer set according to time and distance, but it's set according to an analysis of years worth of data, is what Uber says, but also looking at market conditions and so on. Now, what's the harm in this? The harm in this is that we already know that there's big problems with dynamic price setting for consumers. There's some analysis been done at Harvard Business School about this, about the problems of tacit collusion in price settings, quite harmful to consumers. And then there's good evidence to show that actually for consumers, which is kind of counterintuitive, pricing isn't being set at equilibrium, it's being set above it. There's a lot of arbitrage involved in this type of activity. Now, the tacit collusion comes into effect because you essentially have competing algorithms bouncing off one another. I'm reading your pricing algorithm and you're reading mine, and we're constantly sending signals in an automated way, and we're adjusting pricing accordingly. Now, if that's applied to pay, this is really harmful because of two reasons. Number one, there is already a huge asymmetry in power between the platform and the workers anyway. And so what you end up is these platforms may be sending each other tacit collusion signals about how much to pay workers, but they're using the same common pool of workers effectively because the workers are working across multiple apps at the same time. And so pay can be held low because of that. But also in this sort of real-time reading, effectively what these algorithms are doing is understanding across multiple platforms and across the entire labor pool what is the lowest rate that workers are prepared to accept, which may be well below minimum wage because they'll have to accept a contribution towards their cost at some point. So we say that it's already well understood to be very harmful to consumers, and we would say that the harm to workers for this type of activity and pay setting is even more harmful than it would be for consumers. And secondly, the other thing is, in terms of pay, there's a basic standard of transparency that you should know going to work how much you're going to be paid, and you should have a fair idea of how much work you're going to get. You have no idea with these type of dynamic pay systems about that. Here in the UK, there's a Section 1 statement, is a legal requirement to understand exactly this. Complete transparency in pay. How much are you going to be paid? How much should you expect to be paid for your work? So in this situation, there's a double blindness for a worker. Don't know how much work I'll get. And if I get the work, I don't know how much I'll be paid for it. It'll be dynamically set in real time according to market conditions. What's really going on here is that the platforms are maturing. They've stopped growing. And so VC money is also dried up. There's a push for profitability for these companies that have gone public, particularly Deliveroo and Uber. And so there is nowhere left to turn because they're not operating a workforce that they can optimize. They're not operating a fleet. They're not operating any of these kinds of fixed overhead costs. Simply the only thing they can tune up here is to try and take a bigger share of the fare that's charged to passengers and needs to be shared between the platform and the driver. And so you can expect, as they push for profitability, a much more type of algorithmic game playing around pay and pricing. The second issue is a working time conundrum. So what the lower courts said in the UK is that workers should be paid from log on to log off. What Uber wants is engage time, which is from dispatch to drop off. That means about 40% of your working time as waiting time is unpaid. Now, what do you do with this? Well, the law says pretty much everywhere that as long as you're not pursuing your own interests and you're there making yourself available for that platform, you should be paid. The problem is if you're working with multiple apps at the same time, what do you do with that working time? Now, in Australia, it was recognized that having to work across multiple apps wasn't a sign of necessarily of an empowered self-employed person. It was actually a feature of precarity, that you have to scrabble across multiple apps just to make a living. And so it is perfectly plausible that you should get minimum wage across multiple apps. I'm sure there would be a lot of gnashing and wailing amongst others. But the problem you would have in the EU is working time, because the working time is capped at what, 45 hours a week. So if you were working across 4 apps for 10 hours, in 10 hours you'd be done. So what we think needs to be done with the working time problem is that we link it. This has already been done in New York. I'll get to this in the next slide. The next problem, which is related to this, is this sort of inverted network effects. It's an environmental problem. I think this is the most serious problem in the gig economy. If we cannot address the oversupply of labor, the oversupply of vehicles, in order for this company to drive down their response time. It works opposite ways. We're building positive network effects for the network by driving down the response time. But for the workers, that means lower yield, lower pay, lower bargaining power. Substitution and outsourcing. Substitution, the ability to send somebody else to work, has generally been an employment rights killer. And these platforms have used that. There is no real compelling business reason why I would choose to work for a third party rather than Deliveroo or Uber directly. But they've set up these loopholes in order to demonstrate that substitution is possible and therefore kill legal employment classification. This is now being used by vulnerable workers, undocumented migrants, underage labor, and we have a serious problem with that in the gig economy at the moment. And then the other final issue is around concealed automated management decision-making, which we've just talked about a few minutes ago. Faulty and discriminatory biometric ID, particularly facial recognition. Unfair predictive and other profiling and work allocation. So for example, creating fraud probability scores and using them as a driver, a profile driver in work allocation. Now, when pressed on what they mean by fraud probability, it is, they've said in court, it means it's not criminal fraud or financial fraud. It is your propensity not to obey the rules. And then when pressed on that, well, what rules? Well, they're implied rules because we won't write down rules because that would trigger an employment relationship. So it's effectively, it's nothing to do with fraud. It is a kind of a profiling of workers and then using that to drive decision-making about work allocation, even pay. This is quite dangerous because if it's not transparent, it is opaque performance management, which is completely unfair, particularly if people are investing in assets to go and work on platforms and don't understand that they actually work may be throttled in its allocation to them. Arbitrary, unfair dismissals, misclassifying, again, poor performance as fraud, and poor safety management at work. So what do we want? We want the presumption of employment. This is something that the EU Commission has proposed in a proposed directive for platform work. There should be a presumption of employment, not and it should be the burden of the platform to prove that the worker is really self-employed. At the moment, it's reversed. We say we need an end to this dynamic rate setting for pay. It's completely inappropriate for work. Working time, this is the problem we're just talking about. We need to link pay with capacity utilization. So what I would say is that if I'm working for, say, Uber, and if Uber leaves me or leaves on average about 40% idle time as waiting time, which is typical. There's been a big study done on this in New York for all drivers there. Then what we need to challenge these platforms to do is to reduce that amount of idle capacity on the streets, because it means congestion, poor air quality, and poor pay for workers who are competing for work. So we should positively incentivize these platforms to drive up their utilization rates and link that to pay. That's what's happened in New York. So for example, the way we might do this was might say to Uber, we would say, you need to pay for the engaged time, dispatch to drop off, 1.4 times minimum wage if you've got 40% excess capacity. You can drive that down the more you utilize your workforce in your fleet, because then the workers will be more fully utilized. They will have less waiting time and less risk associated with waiting time. Just transition. So we need to be really careful with things like road pricing, congestion charging. These platforms are advocating for that because they know that they can transfer that cost to labor, and they know they can optimize their platform better than other private users. So it's something to be really careful about in terms of a just transition to electrification or road pricing, smart road pricing. And then in AI management, we need transparency and automated decision-making, pay, allocation, performance management, profiling. These are rights under GDPR, but are widely flouted, disrespected. Access to personal data, again, current rights, but flouted with impunity. We need greater explainability statements than we have at the moment. And explainability, there has been some work done with the Turing Institute here in the UK, with the ICO, in finding a proper standard for explaining how processing is done. So for example, a lot of customers are complaining about cancelled jobs not being picked up, vulnerable passengers late at night not being picked up. They have a right to an explainability statement about how their booking was processed and how it is they ended up having the job getting cancelled. And this would be good for workers also, because we'd have a proper explanation of how pay was set, how people were profiled, and proper accountability for the impact that would have, the greater impact it would have. An end to discriminatory biometric ID systems, no predictive performance profiling and work allocation. And there's got to be a difference between performance management, which exists everywhere, and this type of predictive fraud probability scoring. There should be no place for that kind of performance management anywhere, least of all in a gig economy. No more arbitrary dismissals without proper due process. Again, they avoid this type of process because it would potentially trigger an employment relationship based on the facts, and accountability for occupational safety management. I'm going to stop there. I think I'm well over my time limit. I wish we could talk some more, but I would love to hear from you. As I said, I've left some slides for you to look through to give you an idea of some of the absurdity that gig economy workers face with some of the messaging they get from the platform. But I'll leave you to look through those in your own time, and I look forward to a discussion now if we have some time to do that.
Great. Thank you very much, James. If you want to stop sharing, yeah, there we are. We can see you. And thank you very much for talking us through all of that. Okay, so a quite big area of potential sort of impact that we have to consider here. And some of it, I think, as James has been talking through, we could consider that through the lens of the labor-related standards project that's open right now. Some of it touches very specifically on the kind of impacts of digitalization, which is being sort of mooted as a potential future topic standard. It connects to consumer privacy. It connects to many different topics that already exist in GRI and maybe some that don't. And sectors for that matter. There's clearly sort of a number of different lenses that we could look through for this. I want to give GSSB members an opportunity to ask questions and to engage with this content. Peter, yes, go ahead.
Thank you. It's Peter Colley from the Mining and Energy Union and Global Unions. Thank you for a fascinating presentation, James. It seems to me your presentation fell into two parts. The first part is actually the classic obstruction of the employment relationship issue, which is, well, in some ways, it's old as time itself.
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly a feature of capitalist economic models of seeking to obscure the employment relationship, and a lot of recent work by the GRI has sought to look at workers who are not direct employees, and get more data disclosures on that. But the other aspect of your presentation is about algorithmic control and artificial intelligence control. And I'm rather cynical about that. It seems to me that human resources management often uses, they're always looking for ways to do things more cheaply, but it ends up being very crudely done. These processes aren't inherently hostile to workers, but it's the way they're being implemented. As you said, it's driven by the fact that some of these are public companies now, and they've actually run out of the easy options for reducing their costs. So it's come back to squeezing the worker. But thank you very much.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think what we've seen with these companies is that they're pretty hollowed out inside. They don't want to staff up to run, say, dismissals or appeal process, and they would love to automate as much of the internal management as they do of external. You know, and we see how processes are improved over time. So when Uber introduced facial recognition identification in 2020, it was really crude, and we took action against them in Amsterdam under data protection law, and we won. And all the workers who had been lost their jobs, they also lost their public licenses as well from Transport for London. We won all of those back as well. And what we're seeing now is that those problems are not recurring nearly as much as they were in the past. And it doesn't mean that the problem has gone away. It just means that they're much more careful now, and they've tuned up their systems better than they were before. But that's not necessarily a good thing. The problem is still there, but we can't see it, and it's not accountable. It's not opaque. The technology Uber uses is Microsoft Face API, and Microsoft has entered into a moratorium with the ACLU in America not to sell that product to any police force in America, but yet it's used willy-nilly on workers here. So what we're seeing is, yes, you're right. It's pretty crude. We can see an inflection point. We can attack these issues, but we can see that they become better at integrating these types of technologies over time, which isn't necessarily a good thing.
Bastian.
Yeah. Thanks, James, for the presentation. For the board to consider work in the areas that you're flagging up, could you give us an indication of how you were mentioning a couple of companies that I think come to mind for most of us when we think about these issues, but you were also saying that this whole approach scales actually across industries and is becoming more endemic. Could you give us an idea of sectors where you see this similar dynamics at play in the next years? Because for us, it is very much the question whether we are focused on these subjects for particular sectors, or it is a topic that we so the application of algorithms in this way that you are describing it, is that something that scales across many different sectors? Is that something that pertains only to a few? Could you reflect a bit on that?
Yeah, so one of the slides I've put in the pack, which I presume Harold will share with you, is a slide from a pitch deck from Ernst & Young about contingent labor, which is really, for me, it's kind of like the gig economy for the white collar world. And in that slide, I can share, maybe I should just share my screen real quickly, if that's okay. If I can do that again. Yeah, I think I can. Let me just go to this slide. I just found it fascinating. But it's this whole idea that, you know, corporate creative teams, you know, you could bring in a workforce with a certain set of skills that you might be doing, you know, for a few years, and then you would kick them all out again and get another set in. Yeah, this is it. So this is a deck from Ernst & Young. It's the benefits of using an external workforce, talent as needed basis, less management on performance evaluations, no social security contributions, hooray, no employee protection laws, hooray, no protection against dismissal, no continued remuneration, use of their own equipment, so you don't have to buy them anything, no works councils, reduce labor costs, and so on. So look, you can see from this is the gig economy for white collar workers. So I think this whole area of contingent labor in the corporate world is something to look at. Another thing is, as people have moved to more hybrid working, the use of surveillance tools. I mean, there was an employment tribunal settlement here in the UK last week about a worker who had refused to continue to have his camera on during all the time he was working at home, and he got sacked for it. But he got you know, that was a wrongful dismissal, and the courts found last week it was unreasonable. So we're seeing different aspects of it in the gig economy, but the gig economy as we know it is very much kind of a transport and logistics type of industry. So we're seeing Amazon, for example, had a big announcement last week that they were moving towards more last mile delivery, micro mobility. That is classic gig economy. So I would say logistics, delivery, passenger services, we're seeing this type of dynamic demand response in bus services for rural communities in particular, but it will start creeping into more urban environments in the future as well. So transport, logistics, in the corporate world, you're seeing more and more of this, perhaps retail as well in the future.
Great, thank you. Joseph, yes, go ahead.
Thank you, James, for that wonderful presentation. Very, very pertinent issues related to the new economic models, you know, that is being brought out here. Now, my question is, now, if you look at how the digitalization is changing our life, I think we can expect much more than what you presented today in the next coming 5 to 10 years, especially when the metaverse is rolling out. The low latency networks are getting implemented across the world. Even in India, the 5G is getting implemented now. So what is your, you know, maybe overarching recommendation for a responsible digitalization? I would call it like that. How do you make sure that the startups and the new economic organizations adopted responsible digitalization? What is your one recommendation, having done, you know, so much of research?
It's a bit trite to say, but it really is transparency. I mean, you know, I don't have a particular problem with digitalization or with innovation or use of technology. It can bring very many great and good things, and it has brought some benefits even to these industries that we see today, like taxi and private hire. It has undoubtedly brought some benefits, but it is the use of technology to create opacity, to game people and manipulate people. That's simply unfair, and it's going to cause a rejection of that technology either by consumers or by workers if these types of companies continue to do that. We're already starting to see pushback from consumers. You know, was one woman here in London, and the whole thing went viral. She accused Uber of misogyny, that they had been targeting women at late night to charge them a lot more money to get home, knowing that they would you know, probably have to pay that. Now, I'm not saying that Uber was actually doing that, but that was the impression that women were left with, and they were pushing back. I think we will see more of that pushback from consumers and from workers who will demand that level of transparency in how they work and how they consume these products. So my watchword for people would be, yes, bring on the technology, but protect people's rights, and let's start with transparency. The only reason for opacity is to hide something. Now, what are you hiding? You're hiding an employment relationship, you're hiding an unfair extraction. Those are the reasons for opacity. If we have transparency, we can deal with this. If we don't, we'll have backlash.
Okay, Loredana.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James, for your presentation. This was a very interesting overview of what is happening at the moment. I am Loredana from the ITUC, International Training and Confederation. I just wanted to add on to what you said to Bastian's question on where we can see the algorithmic management expand next. And I totally agree with your analysis that some sectors are more prone to use algorithmic management. But I just wanted to present to the board that indeed this is a use that is made by the wider range of companies today, especially as you mentioned, because of the pandemic and because algorithmic management and the use of data to control the work of workers is now being used as a very easy solution to control workers. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think indeed, as Judy mentioned earlier, our work program for the next few years will touch upon a lot of the issues that you raised today. I would just caution, I would just say that the question of the data privacy and algorithmic management may be a question that we need to approach from a broader perspective, and not just from a sector perspective for our work in the future. Yeah. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Loredana. Other comments, questions? I'm not seeing any in the room here. Any other GSSB in the remote joiners wanting to make a comment or share some views? Okay, great. Well, James, that's perfectly on time, and thank you very much for making the time for us to talk us through these issues. Thank you for sharing the slide deck, which we will share with the GSSB members. And I have no doubt that we will be considering these matters very carefully as we develop the various plans through, connected to the forthcoming work program. Across a number of different possible routes into some of these issues, and I'm sure that the Standards Division will continue to stay in touch with you about any questions that arise as a result of that, or requests for assistance in sort of developing the thinking on that.
Well, thanks.
No, please go ahead, James.
Thanks, Judy. I just wanted to close by saying how important it is, the work that you do. And in Europe here in particular, we have some quite progressive existing legislation, proposed legislation with the GDPR, with the Platform Workers Directive that is now currently with the European Parliament. I have another vote on it in December this year, and then back out to member states. The AI Act, which has been enacted, the Digital Market Services Act, all of those together is really quite good progressive legislation, and yet it doesn't quite work. Because there are so many ways that these companies can sidestep and misclassify what they do in order to sidestep those controls. We see it actively with the GDPR, which is very progressive legislation. And the difficulty is, you know, it takes years to enact that legislation, to design it, put it in place, and yet it can be sidestepped. You can have such a great effect because you can adapt and evolve your standards to keep pace with this. And that would be such an amazing contribution in conjunction with the regulatory compliance and legislation and regulatory frameworks that we're seeing. If you could adapt smart standards and push them and advocate for them and demand them, you would do such great work. I could see really how important standards might be for delivering where regulation alone cannot. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I think unless anybody has a final comment to make, I think that is the conclusion of that part of the agenda. And as I said before, we're going to close the public meeting for an hour, or yes, about just under an hour, to accommodate it's both the break and the unused portion of the agenda, which we'll use for administrative matters. James, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll continue to stay in touch.
Thank you. Have a good conference.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Tease. We're going to restart that video presentation that we started. It will all work out. We are, because of the delays, we are going to have to make an adjustment to our agenda this afternoon, which will oblige us to move the session on the continuation of the discussion of the draft that was slated for 3:30 Amsterdam time. We're going to have to table that for tomorrow. We ought to be able to fit it all in.
Hello everyone, my name is Ian Carruthers. I'm the chairman of the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to address you today, even although only virtually. As we all know, the topic of sustainability reporting has really risen to the top of the agenda around the world, particularly in the private sector, but I think also increasingly in the public sector. Certainly, GSSB has been thinking about this through the development of its consultation paper on advancing public sector sustainability reporting, which we issued earlier on this year. And we've been tremendously encouraged by the welcome that GRI has extended to our potential involvement in this space, both when we launched the consultation paper, but also through supporting our discussions at the Public Sector Standards Setters Forum that we held recently in Cascais in Portugal. And we're very grateful for Bastian about taking the time to be with us for that very important event. In terms of what I want to cover today, I was going to give you a bit of background about GSSB and the work that's been doing over the last 25 years in the financial reporting space, and then move into talking about what we're doing currently in the sustainability reporting arena and what our stakeholders have said to us and how we might proceed in that area over the remainder of this year and into next year. I thought it was useful, though, before I do that, just to share some thoughts on the public sector, because it is significant around the world and it's a very diverse sector. So if you look at its economic significance, you can measure that in terms of proportion of GDP, greater than 40%. You can measure it in terms of its activities as an employer, 20% of the global workforce, but also not often focused on, but governments are a significant player in the global bond market, 40% of the overall $100 trillion market, according to the World Bank report earlier on this year. And governments are structured very differently. So you'll always have a central federal government level with ministries and statutory bodies doing regulation and so on. Some states have state level governments, but always you will have a local level of government or municipalities delivering frontline services to the local populations. You may also have a significant sector of state-owned industries, utilities and so on, operating on a quasi-commercial basis, but set up as separate legal entities. Partnerships with the private sector and unincorporated bodies. So a lot of different types of organisation delivering a wide range of functions. And certainly very significant is the government's role in terms of policy and regulation, shaping the activities of the economy as a whole, tax collection impacting on all of us, both at a central and a local level, and then its impact through the funding that government gives, whether that's to other bodies across the public sector, to private sector bodies to influence different types of activity, or to us as individuals through benefits. So a whole range, and that's really the challenge in terms of standard setting. A bit about GSSB as a standard setter. We are the global financial reporting standard setter for the public sector. We are an independent board. We have members from around the world, but it's essentially a volunteer board. I, as chairman, am the only executive member. We develop our guidance through conventional due process, through a series of public consultations, and those are overseen by the Independent Public Interest Committee, comprising individuals from the World Bank, IMF, OECD, and the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions. In terms of funding, the International Federation of Accountants is a very significant funder for us, as it is in the case of our sister boards, the International Audit and Assurance Standards Board and the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants, but we're also funded by regional organisations and by sovereign governments. So we've been standard setting for about 25 years, initially as the IFAC Public Sector Committee, and in the early days we were developing standards based on the then international accounting standards. And those were the ones where essentially government activities are very similar to those in the private sector. So you can add examples and make relatively small changes in terminology, but you're not talking significant changes for public sector. Then we moved on in the next phase to start to develop those public sector standards on areas like taxation unique to the public sector. We also needed to try and keep pace with a very active work programme from the ISB in its early years, and we started work on a conceptual framework for standard setting to guide our activities in those, particularly in those public sector areas. That took us 6 or 7 years. That was completed then in 2014. And during this period, we also started to operate much more through interacting with our stakeholders directly through roundtables and so on, consulting on our first strategy during that period. And then in recent years, since I became chairman at the start of 2016, the focus has shifted again into applying the conceptual framework in practice and also in bringing us right bang up to date with the latest international financial reporting standards. And we're coming towards the end of our current 5-year strategy and really coming into the finishing straight on some important projects, which will mean that we will actually be delivering 5 new international public sector accounting standards by the end of 2023 in important areas like accounting for revenue and measurement of assets, particularly those used for service provision. So that will have quite a big impact on the shape of our standards. So if you look at the degree to which they focus on the public sector, you can see that's the profile at the moment, with the quarter circle at the top, meaning that we're relatively close to the original IFRS, and at the bottom with the whole blue circle, those are the standards that we've developed purely for the public sector. Now, if I look forward to the end of 2023, we will increase the public sector focus of our standards. But the really big change is going to be in alignment with IFRS, where we've essentially been playing catch up with the big standards issued in areas like revenue, financial instruments, leases, and so on a few years back. So if you look at the position earlier on this year, red means we're on an old version of the standard, green at the bottom means we're on the new version of the standard, and we've implemented all relevant changes from the public sector. And we will have a significant change as we issue those new standards in terms of alignment with IFRS. We will complete that big catch-up process. So what's happening then in terms of accrual reporting around the world? Well, there is a big shift going on at the moment in terms of the level of usage of accrual by governments. In the private sector, that's taken as red, but in the public sector, there are still a significant number of governments that are just reporting on the cash basis at the moment. You can see the shift that's going on in the International Public Sector Financial Accountability Index, which was published last year. And you certainly saw a rise in the number of governments, up 6% since the original index in 2018. But it's the trend that's most striking when you look forward in terms of forecast position by the end of 2025 and then through to the end of 2030. And you see that very dramatic shift from 30% of governments on accrual in 2020 up to 50% forecast for the end of 2025, and then through into the 70s, with the majority of governments reporting on accrual by the end of the decade. And that's happening around the world. It's not just in Europe, it's particularly in Latin America, it's also in Africa, and it's in Asia. And alongside that, we see much more usage of the global standards going on. So you see much more use of IPSAS as the reporting framework as we move forward through that period. So if I turn now to sustainability reporting, what's going on in that space? Well, we are still in the consultation phase on natural resources, which is a project that crosses both financial reporting and also into non-financial reporting. And actually, the deadline for responses was yesterday. So we will start to analyse what our constituents have said there. One of the areas where we approved draft guidance in our recent meeting in September was what we call reporting sustainability programme information. This also goes alongside the work on green budgeting principles that OECD has been taking forwards, and we will be issuing guidance there in draft form at the end of October or early November. And then, of course, we've had our consultation paper on advancing public sector sustainability reporting, where comments closed at the beginning of September, and I'll give you an overview of that fairly shortly. So what are we doing then in terms of sustainability programme information? Well, there what we're trying to do is add guidance relatively quickly to our existing guidance on general purpose financial reporting. So we have what's called Recommended Practice Guideline 3, which is reporting at a service level on inputs, outputs, outcomes, and those sorts of measures. And we think that can be read across to, if you like, green-related, sustainability-related programs. And we're adding practical examples on common types of transaction there. And then also to our guidance on reporting on long-term financial sustainability. And this is looking at the inflows and outflows for governments over a period, which may be up to 50 years in some cases, if you want to pick up on changes in population and so on over that period. And again, we think that actually it's important to make it clear that the approaches that are proposed, that are recommended in that guidance, can also be used to bring in the impact of sustainability programs that are required in order to deliver SDGs, net zero, climate targets, and so on. So that guidance coming out around about the end of the month will be on a relatively short consultation, 2-month consultation, and then we're aiming to get that out in the first half of next year. So if I turn then to the results of the consultation on advancing public sector sustainability reporting, we're currently working through the 70 written responses that we received. As you can see, a good range from around the world. And we've also held regional roundtables during the 4-month consultation period, attended by almost 500 people from 127 different countries. Now, what did they actually tell us in the those roundtables? So we focused on the questions in the consultation paper. Does the public sector need sustainability reporting guidance? Everybody pretty much said yes. There was also very strong support for IPSASB leading the development of that guidance. Strong support for collaboration with other international bodies, and by that we were talking really about GRI and ISSB. We talked about the sort of framework that we might use to move forward with. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Again, the support for all of that, drawing on GRI and ISSB guidance, and also for the key enablers that we saw in order for IPSASB as a previously financial reporting standard setter to move into this space, and again, support for that. So moving on to the framework, and very much consistent with the approach being taken or being proposed by ISSB in S1, a focus on governance strategy, risk management and targets, the sort of TCFD approach. We think that can work for the public sector, and we would propose to move forward with an overarching framework, probably based around the proposals in S1. We'll have to wait and see how that's finalised. But we believe that by moving forward based on ISSB guidance, we could start to focus in that financial sustainability related space. But of course, broader aspects very much relevant for the public sector. We picked up on Sustainable Development Goals in the consultation paper, and also that's where we really see that the ESG guidance, which GRI has already produced, could be extremely relevant for the public sector. And that's where we would certainly like to explore with you the options around sector guidance for either the whole of the public sector or individual parts of the public sector. Of course, those would need to be supported by guidance on metrics specific to different functions across the sector, and there clearly, you know, there's a range of guidance, whether it's SASB related, whether it's produced to support measurement of GRI, progress on Sustainable Development Goals, or also the statistical framework. So we'll need to have a look at that. But again, I think important to move forward based on existing guidance and seeing how that works for the public sector, rather than leaping into the development of public sector specific guidance. So what's happening now? What's going on for the rest of the year? Well, we've presented initial analysis to the board meeting in September. We also presented that at our Public Sector Standard Setters Forum in Cascais, Portugal, and we were extremely grateful for Bastian taking the time to come and join us, and there was a lot of interest in what he said and you know, the potential for working with GRI going forwards. We're currently working on analysing those 70 written responses further. We also have discussions going with a number of parties on potential to fund our work going forwards, and that is very much one of the key factors that we will focus on in developing a formal board proposal on whether to move forward or not. And obviously we need to have discussions with our Public Interest Committee, our Consultative Advisory Group and IFAC before proposing to move forward, and the board will discuss whether to move forward or not in early December at our meeting in Toronto. If we do move forward, well, what might we be doing during 2023? Well, we certainly see the need to develop a community across the public sector. We obviously have strong relationships globally, but those are focused on financial reporting, and there are a lot of other actors in this space. So we would need to start to reach out to them, as we have already begun to do through the consultation process. And in particular, we want to form a sustainability reference group to advise the board going forwards on the issues from the various different perspectives. And that needs to be as broad as possible in terms of those different stakeholder groups. And inevitably, there's an outreach and education process that needs to run in parallel with moving forward in this space. We would certainly aim to influence the very active standard setting debate going on in order to ensure that public sector perspectives are at least factored into the inevitable decisions on direction that will need to be taken. Wherever possible, we would certainly advocate that if there's an approach that would work for the public sector going forwards, that is taken, because clearly that will enable interoperability and so on. And in terms of actually really beginning to move forward, we think that the collaborative relationships with GRI and ISSB would be absolutely the bedrock for this. That could be through sort of formal mechanisms, representation on advisory groups, working on projects together. I've mentioned sector standard or standards for the public sector as being a very obvious opportunity for joint working between ISSB and GRI. And obviously, the more that we can begin to build a common view and actually coordinate our strategies, the better. I know you're working on a forward strategy at the moment. Certainly ISSB will be developing its plans for the next 5 years, 24 to 2028, and we'll be consulting on those later next year. So the more that we can talk together during that period, the better. And we think it's important to get going quickly. We think all of the above activities will be catalysed through starting to develop guidance and really work through issues. So we would propose to do that again, as I underline, working in collaboration with GRI and ISSB, using existing guidance rather than leaping into development of anything specific to the public sector. So I hope that has been helpful introduction. Unfortunately, I'm away on leave this week, but my colleague Ross Smith, who's our Programme and Technical Director, will be available to support your discussion. I certainly hope that we will be able to work together going forwards, and I look forward to discussions with you in future. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody again for bearing with us through that little interlude with the technical difficulties, but I hope that was very clear with the presentation now. I don't think we need this slide deck. I think we need to have the participants with us. That's more like it. Thank you very much. And I'd like to welcome Ross Smith as well from ISSB, who, as Ian said in his presentation, is here to speak with us today. Ross.
Yes, thank you very much for having me here today, and apologies that your first introduction to GSSB and Ian was the video that didn't work well. Apologies for that. Just for a little bit of background on myself, my name is Ross Smith. I'm the GSSB Program and Technical Director, and I lead the staff team in our work to develop the International Public Sector Accounting Standards. The staff team is based in Toronto, Canada, where we have a small team office. The majority of our staff team is based here in Canada, but we also have a few in different locations around the world supporting our standard setting work. As Ian said, traditionally, we've focused solely on public sector accounting standards. We do have some guidance that he referred to in his video that relates to reporting outside the financial statements. So it's not a completely foreign territory that we're thinking of moving into in the sustainability space. I think that's probably enough of me droning on after a long video. So maybe I could just open up if there's any questions anybody'd like to ask about GSSB, our work, our program, Ian's video. I'm more than happy to answer any and all questions anybody might have.
Thanks, Ross. Yes, I'll just open it up for discussion. It looks like Robin wants to make a comment. Please go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Ross. I just had a question about reporting and disclosure about policy outcomes. I know we've talked a bit about having government-owned enterprises. I'm sort of clear about how that's different from sort of the sovereign wealth funds and in terms of the way GRI slices and dices sectors. And I guess the missing piece for me is around where you have like a state or federal sort of agency or department that's got carriage of a policy outcome, and their whole reason to exist is to shift the dial on something that might be connected to a sustainable development goal. For example, is that an area that's covered in RPG 3?
Yeah, that's a great question. So RPG3, when we design our guidance, we design it for entities in particular. We don't set out which specific entity should or shouldn't apply the guidance. We do positively set out the type of entities our guidance is designed for, mainly being public sector entities and various characteristics around those. But the model itself in RPG3 is a general reporting model that looks at service performance objectives as defined in the standard. And an entity would determine which its service performance objectives are either at the entity level or at a program level, and then report on the program itself in relation to its design. So if the program relates to specific outputs or outcomes or both, the model provides information on the quantitative and qualitative information and disclosures that should be provided to support that reporting in a very principled, generic way. And so that's what Ian was talking about, is us adding additional examples to help people understand how certain types of sustainability programs would be accounted for using this model. And specifically because we had some of our constituents who were not clear that we could use that model in RPG3 for sustainability type reporting. So from the staff perspective, we thought it was quite clear that you would apply this model if you had a sustainability program. But because of some misunderstandings with constituents, we thought it best to clarify it. So the model itself, we're not proposing to change, and it's been existent since 2013. Hope that helps you a little bit. I'm not sure if it gets you all the way on the question.
Yeah, yeah, it does. Thanks for just describing that. So what you're looking at the moment is perhaps some guidance or case studies or examples to sort of flesh that out or demonstrate the flexibility of RPG3.
Exactly. And we've got 4 proposed types of programs financed through different mechanisms that we've proposed examples for. So one's a green bond finance program, one's a carbon tax program, one's an investment in infrastructure to mitigate the changes of climate change, and one's a government tax expenditure through the tax code to promote investment in green initiatives. And we've based these examples on real world programs that governments are applying across the world, going through our network, but we've obviously analyzed those and made them a little more simplistic than the real fact patterns, but they are based on real programs.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Maybe one point I could emphasize that Ian touched on his video that I think is a key part of our discussions so far is that we're not looking to create a new space for reporting or competing guidance for guidance that already exists for reporting on sustainability. We're very much looking to put a public sector lens and look at existing guidance and how that can be better applied to public sector specific entities. Very much with a mind of consolidating and helping clarify the use of guidance that already exists in the public sector rather than starting a whole greenfield program and starting competing guidance. And I know Ian kind of touched on that implicitly, but really think that's important. I think the consolidation we're seeing on the private sector side from a reporting perspective is quite positive. And I think with us entering, it's more to help our constituents that are concerned about public sector understand what guidance is available and how to apply that in a public sector lens, rather than creating greenfield guidance that takes different approaches. It's really about application of guidance in public sector to real public sector issues.
Okay, thank you. Bastian.
Yeah, Ross, maybe you can expand a bit on the timeline component of a project that you're envisioning. I think Ian outlined that you're going to a no-go decision by December, but then you're also building technical capacity in the area. The GSB here is discussing a 3-year work program, and it is very much about whether it will fall into that time horizon that we invest into public sector sustainability reporting, and we've framed it as up as more, certainly one of the considerations. Can you speak a bit to how this would normally unfold in your due process, and how quickly you see a substantive work emerging?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bastian. And I guess I'll touch on one aspect in the video before I get into that might help with this. So we do have a long history of working in financial reporting off guidance developed by others, in particular, the International Financial Reporting Standards Board that sets private sector guidance. And we already have a process in place that we can use to guide our work. And that process really makes us focus on the key public sector issues that we need to add into existing guidance rather than redeliberating all aspects of existing guidance. We've been applying that for about 15, 20 years now in our financial reporting program. And our first approach here in moving this forward is to take that process and apply it to sustainability guidance that will be developed by the ISSB and other existing standards that might be applicable, such as those produced by GRI. And I'm setting that up in that way because I think you asked like how it would traditionally work. I think how it would traditionally work if we were doing a greenfield project it might move a little bit slowly. But if the board takes the decision to add sustainability reporting as a new arm of our work program in December 2022, as I expect they might, we will be starting work immediately in January 2023, and this will come on our work program. Now that initial work will require us doing a few months of work around our due process and kind of setting up how that's going to work, so it's clear to our stakeholders how we'll set standards. But we will plan to hit the ground running and start working to develop our proposals for public sector sustainability reporting by looking to progress that ISSB is making on S1 and S2, and by working with other organizations in the field, such as GRI, if that's something that is available. And we'll be looking to immediately add some staff resources, additional staff resources. So we've recently added a new staff member who is already starting to work in the sustainability space and getting up to speed. So that person will work with, you know, 1 or 2 additional sustainability staff that we plan to bring on in-house should we decide to take on sustainability standards officially to our work program. And that is, again, as Ian said, that is a go or no go decision that will be made in December. But should it be a yes decision, we plan to proceed very quickly, because it's clear from our stakeholders that it's an urgent issue that we need to be more flexible on than we would in our traditional programs, so that there is some public sector guidance available for those entities that are starting to attack this issue.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from GSSB? Not seeing any at the moment or on the screen here. I think I think that's all very clear, Ross. So I think probably we can move on at this point. Thank you very much. Yes, of course. Yes, Mia's got a question. Hold on. Yeah.
Sorry, Ross, I'm not technically a GSSB member, but taking advantage of being in the room, I just wanted to ask a question. Just, you mentioned working with other organizations, and obviously ISSB and the GSSB and GRI was in there. Could you give us just a little bit more detail on sort of the take up? So I'm just thinking about the global application of the work that IPSASB does, and whether you have other national standard setters, just to give us a feel for the public sector standard setting sort of environment.
Yeah, that's a great point. So just to clarify, you mean the take up of our standards in
So I
total?
shouldn't say take up, meant more application. So it applies globally, as I understand it, and then just reflecting on some of the other types of organizations that might be also already developing standards for the public sector, not necessarily sustainability standards, but sort of other standard setting bodies.
Okay, great. I think I understand. So from a perspective at the international level, we are the only board that's developing public sector accounting standards. We don't have a competitor in that sense. There are a number of national standard setters that set public sector accounting standards for their particular jurisdictions. And those national standard setters, sometimes they'll do their own public sector standard setters without any reference to IPSAS. Sometimes they'll indirectly reference IPSAS and they'll use our standards in their development process. And then we have another tranche of standard setters that use IPSAS directly, either exactly as we issue them or with the national endorsement process that brings them into their legislation. As Ian outlined in his presentation, we're in a growth phase at the moment. Around 30% of the 165 jurisdictions that were surveyed back in 2020 were on accrual accounting, and a high proportion of those were using IPSAS in some way. However, projecting forward to 2030, that goes up to a number of 70% of jurisdictions surveyed will be reporting on accrual and using IPSAS in some way. And I should note that, you know, I'm not sure how close you are to financial reporting, but unlike the public or the private sector, in the public sector, a lot of governments still report on a cash basis. So there is a public financial management issue that we are pushing, that accrual is important for governments to adopt to better manage their public finances. So that's one of the key objectives of the IPSASB's work. In addition to setting standards, it's advocating the use of accrual standards for public sector accounting. Now, this is a debate that happily in the private sector, you know, was won maybe 20, 30 years ago, you know, or maybe even longer. In the public sector, in many jurisdictions, it hasn't been a live debate for many years. They're reporting on accrual accounting. They have good, high quality financial information. But in some jurisdictions, including developed jurisdictions, it's still an ongoing conversation where some governments, based on their structure and how they get information, don't yet see a need for accrual accounting. So that's an important aspect of our work. And we see the sustainability reporting stream as an extension of that public financial management aim, that as governments deal with sustainability issues in a broader public financial management lens, it is an issue that needs to be tackled. And we think reporting on it is an effective way to get governments to pay better attention on how they manage such programs and effectively integrate that information into their financial decision making.
Thank you, Ross. That's great.
Any others? Okay, I think Ross, thank you again for your time and for joining us today, and please extend our thanks to Ian as well for the remote presentation or recorded presentation. I'm sure the Standards Division team will continue to be in touch with you as we carry out the consultations around the work program at this point.
Great, and thank you very much for the time today. I really appreciate the opportunity to join, and I hope this is the start of a long collaboration between GRI and GSSB.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Okay, we have a bit of a schedule adjustment. We have half an hour before we are joined by Manuel Faber and Sue Lloyd from the ISSB. We don't really have enough time to do much of value on the continuation of the GSSB work program discussion and to take a break. So I think we'll just take a break at this point, and we'll reconvene back on schedule. As I said earlier, we ought to be able to conclude what we need to with the work program through the course of the day tomorrow. We do have some substantial time in for that. Okay, so we will pause the live stream for until 4:30 Amsterdam time, and reconvene then. Thank you.
So the only thing is,
Hello, can you hear us?
yes, we can hear you.
Great, okay.
Excellent. So you're all good? Yeah. Okay, perfect. I guess the only thing is like you kind of have to move it around.
Where's the camera?
The camera's right here, and then so what it does is just gonna automatically.
So is it better if me and the manual solicitor?
Well, I have
Either side
it's
of
a
the camera?
360 camera, so basically it will just supposedly will focus on whoever's talking into this room.
Okay.
So you shouldn't have to worry about like really looking at it.
Once everyone's out, it settles down there.
So the camera is where?
Here.
Here, not here. Anyway, so that's
Yeah.
yours.
Yeah,
Do we need it or?
not really, it's just connecting us.
It's just connecting it. Okay, great.
And we're back on. Okay, welcome back to our listeners on the YouTube channel, as well as to our members and guests in this penultimate session of the GSSB meeting for this first day today. We're very pleased indeed to be joined virtually by Manuel Faber and Sue Lloyd, the chair and one of the vice chairs respectively of the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, with whom we have been having a very fruitful collaborative discussion in recent months. We have invited them to talk with us essentially about that collaboration, where from their perspective they see the priority areas, the kind of the basics of what collaboration needs to reflect between our organizations, and anything that we should be thinking about as we pursue the next phase of our work program. I'm going to turn it over to Emmanuel and Sue to just introduce themselves and to say hello, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Judy. So I'm Emmanuel Faber, the chair of ISSB, and I'm really happy to be with you and with Sue.
Hi there, Sue Lloyd, one of the vice chairs of the International Sustainability Standards Board, and really delighted to be talking to you today.
So thank you, Judy, for your kind words. Thanks for inviting us, and thank you, colleagues, for having us. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be speaking and engaging with you as a board. We're actually, as we speak, in Montreal, where we are holding our first board meeting in our one of our global offices here in Montreal. So that's the third board meeting of ISSB as such. And as Sue will elaborate on after me, that's a very eventful week, which I think makes it a perfect opportunity for us to engage with you at a more technical level. So maybe let me rewind everything back to where it started, I think, between ISSB and GRI. So ISSB was announced at the COP26, and with a view at that time that the chair would be appointed by the end of last year. And this is what happened when I was appointed on the 16th of December, together with Sue as the first vice chair. Sue was the longtime vice chair of the IASB. So I was blessed to be joined by such an incredible person, and having such an experience in standard setting, coming from the accounting and finance world, which would be the perfect connection for us and connectivity with the important, crucial language that we need to learn to speak in sustainability, which is the language of investors. It took about 2 days for Elko to publicly share his congratulations and warm welcome to this world on LinkedIn and social network. And so that's how we started the conversation. I didn't know Elko, but a few weeks later, we had a first substantive discussion, and it took us another couple of months until we really found, and certainly Sue and myself on the ISSB side, realized that there was going to be very synergetic situations between GRI and ISSB. And that led to the first ever strategic commitment cooperation agreement signed by ISSB with GRI early spring this year, which in essence was looking after the opportunity of being able to offer for us being on the pillar 1 of full materiality, and for GRI being on the pillar 2 of impact in the full materiality remit, that we could together offer a seamless suite of solutions in terms of sustainability reporting to companies that have to or want to report on a multi-stakeholder basis on their sustainability situation. And so it was a way to clarify that ISSB was entirely focused on investor materiality, had no intention whatsoever to go outside of that. And it was also clarifying that we felt GRI was, with 25 years of experience on impact materiality, was the right partner for us to build that. Now, in order to build that, we needed to have the intent of making sure that there would not be overlap between our standards, nor any gap between our standards, so that, and again, there would be a seamless suite. Given the long time existence of GRI, and that we are only starting, as you know, with the S1 foundational general requirement standard for us, and the S2 being climate, of course, it meant that over time we would need to adjust the way and coordinate the way we are moving on standard setting agendas, and finding ways of simplifying, aligning language, concepts, etc., in order to make sure that, again, we make our global, we make our combined standards a language that is, as we are looking at it from an investor perspective, as cost-effective and decision useful. The same could apply to the combination of both in terms of cost effectiveness and decision or information usefulness for a broader stakeholder perspective. So this is really what started, which we started to also discuss in Davos with a number of very interested parties. In that, I have to say that I was surprised in many ways that we received a number of positive comments about our cooperation agreement or MOU within the comment letters that we received on our feedback of the consultation on S1 and S2 for us. And that paved the way for probably, you know, a momentum behind our future collaboration. An additional point that I would bring to this feedback that I'm sharing with you that may not be as relevant for you as a standard setting board, but more for the GRI organization overall, is that within ISSB, we have started to also in the IFRS engagement team and with some of our members, board members at ISSB, we've started to engage on cooperation that is not about technical standard setting, but about advocacy and adoption, in particular on the voluntary adoption part of our strategy for adoption and market use of our standards. And we have started to discuss the opportunity of having joint education material and events platforms. We've been starting to discuss also potential even field work that could be done, given in certain regions the very significant and density of network that has been established by GRI for years now. And for us, this is important because the inclusiveness of the global baseline that we want to build is there from inception in our work. We want that from a standard setting standpoint, we are clear that we are setting the bar high and where the very sophisticated investors of today and just slightly tomorrow are having their needs and being able to answer those needs, and for highly sophisticated companies to be able to report against those needs, but also ensuring that there is a global baseline that embraces everyone and that embarks everyone into a multi-phase transition, so that there is not a baseline for a heavy few and another one for or known for the rest of the world. And so your presence, in particular in the Global South, can be of essence as well to our dialogue with those jurisdictions and those companies. And therefore, I think that is also beyond the technical work that can happen over time with you. There is also another aspect with GRI, which is this on-field concrete cooperation. I will stop here, as I was referring to the fact that we are having an eventful week that discusses the first redeliberation on S1 and S2 for climate. We are also having a week, and actually this afternoon in here in Montreal, we're going to address the agenda consultation for our future work. And I would now ask Sue if she can to share some views about how that, what does that mean for potential further cooperation with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. And before I start, I'd just like to add in the more detailed technical side of things, in addition to the cooperation we've had with ALCO, given I'm responsible for the technical delivery for the board, I've benefited from having a series of discussions with your technical staff, along with our technical staff, so particularly with Judy, Bastian and Peter Paul, on some of the more granular levels of standard setting. And I'd like to say that that's a very cooperative and constructive relationship, which makes me feel very positive about the road ahead for us working together on technical matters. And so Emmanuel's mentioned the fact that this afternoon we're going to start talking again about our agenda consultation and the way forward, and setting that in in context, I think there's a couple of different aspects there that we'll discuss, which give us the opportunity to think about work with GRI. And indeed, you actually get name checked in the staff paper. So I'll come to that. So in the agenda consultation paper, the staff are proposing a couple of things, and this is all with a view towards building to a document that we plan to publish in the first half of next year, where we'll be asking for input from our stakeholders on what future work we should do after we finish the work on our two draft documents, S1, the general requirements document, and S2, our climate document. And in fact, the staff are saying to the recommending to the board that we take a little bit of take stock in the first instance of how far we get with those two foundational initial documents and what we might need to do to support those documents before we move on to brand new topics. And some of the foundational work that we're looking at could well involve work with GRI. And this is where you are mentioned in the paper, because one of the areas that the staff recommend that we do without consulting for really confirmation is looking at interoperability, both with the work of jurisdictions, but also with GRI's work, because we want this good relationship and connection between our respective standards. We already note that working with you on that connectivity work is important. Another area that's mentioned in the agenda consultation, which I think is again a candidate for working alongside you, is work on our digital taxonomy. So we're planning next year to publish proposals for a digital taxonomy that will be the means for digital reporting for our initial standards. But an important piece of digital work that we're interested in working on is ensuring that we have compatibility between the taxonomy that we have for our work and your taxonomy. So the digital taxonomy, I think, is another area in our agenda consultation work that is important for us and potentially working with you. Then, of course, looking forward to the future, we will later in this year talk about potential future topics for work beyond S1 and S2. And this, I think, is going to be a really fantastic opportunity for us to be in close coordination with you and your technical team to make sure that when we're talking about potential future topics for work, we're aware of what work you're looking at doing and make sure that we're looking for opportunities to align our work plans. Because the best way, of course, to do standard setting is for us to work in tandem with one another rather than having to come along after the fact and improve operability subsequently. Excuse me. Another thing that I'd like to mention that we're talking about at this week's board meeting, where I think there's potential for future work with you as well, is a paper that we'll discuss, I think, on Friday, which is our staff's recommendations for how we build on the work of the SASB that we've inherited through the consolidation with the Value Reporting Foundation. There's a number of recommendations in there for how we build on the SASB's work. But one of the important staff recommendations there is how we proceed with the industry-based proposals that were included as part of our climate document. As some of you might know, in our S2 draft, we proposed that there would be mandatory disclosures on an industry-based basis about climate that would be part of the requirements in S2. We've had some feedback that would suggest that some think that that shouldn't be mandatory in the near term. And one of the reasons why it might not be mandatory from day one is the desire to do some more work to make sure that those standards are appropriate for international application and that we look at interoperability with other classification systems. The staff are recommending that we proceed with Appendix B in our climate document, but that we make it non-mandatory for now, but signal the intent to make it mandatory in the future. One of the things I think that we would like to do in that interim period, assuming that the board agrees with that staff recommendation, would be to take the time to work with you and with Europe as well, to see if between the three of us, we can ensure that we've got as much interoperability as possible between the sector-specific classifications and disclosures that we each require to improve the position from an effectiveness perspective for those using our respective standards. So I think you can see there's a number of layers of the discussions that we have in our board meeting this week, which really already highlight areas for potential future work between our two organizations. Anything I missed, Emmanuel?
No, I don't think. Thank you very much, Sue. I would echo again your point about the European situation. We have received direct public and private feedback that it would be useful that GRI and ourselves would work jointly with Europe on those topics, and in particular when it comes to industry-based. I'd say two things about the European situation right now that I know from what is public here is that the Sustainability Reporting Board of EFRAG has decided after the feedback on the consultation that ended in August to reduce significantly the density of the disclosure requirements, yet of course staying true to covering the whole of E, S, and G as the CSRD is requesting from them, but reducing by 30 to 50% the amount of disclosure requirements as part of that, which opens the opportunity that when this density will increase again, there can be additional adjustments and alignments being sought as we are going to develop our own additional work beyond the existing S1 and S2. And as we, and potentially with you, are also working on that. So that's the first aspect. And the second, when it comes to Europe, is that there is now a clear perspective that industry-based standardization will happen on a program that's going to be 2023 to 2026 in Europe, which, and again, means that the next couple of years will be available in a way to ensure the interoperability of as much as possible of our three standards here. Just wanted to offer these two disaggregated perspectives when it comes to Europe.
Thank you very much, both of you, for all of that input. And I think we absolutely share your ambition as far as the sort of vision of coherence and interoperability is concerned, and also just really share the keenness to put some substance around the memorandum of understanding between our organizations and really get started as effectively as we can at a working level. I think we are off to a good start sort of internally. I think it's kind of more of a case now for us to try to weave this collaboration more substantially and publicly into our work programs going forward, and to be able to reflect on that as we make some decisions in the coming months on both sides. Of course, we'll await the outcome of your ISSB meeting this week and the future ones as well. But I'd like at this point to just open it up to anyone who wants to ask a question or to add something to the conversation here. Yeah, Kent, please.
Yes, I'd like to know if you could tell me a little bit about the status, particularly of the S2 standard. That is, where's the exposure draft at this point, and when do you expect it to be completed?
So as Emmanuel mentioned, this month we'll have our first substantive discussions redeliberating the proposals in S2, starting with the topic of GHG emissions in Scope 3. And our plan is to finish the substantive discussions on the climate document and actually the general requirements document around the end of this year, and to publish the final versions as early as possible in 2023.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah, Michel.
I could comment a bit, Michel Wacher from Solvay. You answered a lot of my questions in your talks this hour today. I will say that the early announcements of Europe and ISSB had me a bit worried because we all have the same issue today. There are too many standards. Industry or reporters have to make choices on the one they follow. So we're not happy because we have to align to multiple standards. investors are not happy because since the reporters make different choices, they can't compare them. And so in a way, it was good news for me to see that heavyweights were entering the arena and that it would put a little order in it. But if ISSB and the European Union were diverging from GRI, which was the most used standard at the time, well, obviously we would stay in the same mess. So convergence for me is good news. The issue that remains for me is timing. Working with GRI, we saw that preparing a standard is a work that takes 2 years between the time you need to organize a team, the working sessions that you have, coming to a draft that goes into exposure for 6 months, doing the corrections and so on. It's 2 years. And so when both Europe and ISSB announced that they would be ready in a couple of years with all the standards, I was very worried. This is where my question comes. What do you see your agenda being, and how fast do you think you're going to deploy all the standards?
Well, in terms of the first 2 standards, our hope is to complete them as early as possible in 2023. And we are on track to do that. I think what's encouraging in the feedback that we received on both of the documents, and I should say we got a very high level of engagement, over 1,400 comment letters, so a lot of feedback from our stakeholders. But the overall feedback was very, very supportive. So most of what we're looking at in the re-deliberations is making sure that we provide enough clarity and context and support, almost supporting materials for our stakeholders who are new to sustainability reporting in particular, to understand what it is they're being asked to do in as clear a way as possible. So that's a lot of what the re-deliberations are about, as opposed to sort of fundamentally questioning the proposal. So that's helpful, I think, from a timeline perspective. In terms then of how quickly we then fill out the suite of standards, that's really then the subject of our agenda consultation. So when we go out and ask our stakeholders for feedback in the first half of next year, we will be asking them what they think the priority topics are for us to move to next. And that will determine the scope of our work and indeed the pace of our work, depending on how many different topics that we take on once we get past these first 2 initial topics. I think one important thing, though, perhaps to note is that what we do have in our S1 document is actually already a proposal that would result in the provision of information beyond just climate. In S1, we include the notion of referring to materials produced by others to ensure that a company provides information not just on climate, but on all of the significant sustainability risks and opportunities that they are exposed to. So it's not a climate only set of materials. But the key thing then is how quickly do we move to fill in more specific requirements that are put in place by the ISSB ourselves. I think the last thing I'd say is, so that means it's uncertain timing and will be informed by our stakeholders. But I think what we have really benefited from at the ISSB in the work that we've done to date is not starting with a clean sheet of paper. We started with the work of the TCFD, the group of 5, and others to build on. The work of the SASB. And so going forward, I think we'll be looking at partnerships with others, and GRI would certainly be a candidate for those sorts of partnerships where we can work from existing materials rather than starting with a blank sheet of paper, which I hope will improve our timeliness and efficiency.
Okay. Climate is the easiest, by the way, because so much has been written on climate that it's probably the easiest topic. It's when you will get to biodiversity, circular economy, and topics like that where, and social aspects, there is still a lot to learn in there.
If I may add, Michel, to this point, our deliberation this afternoon will include a discussion about what are the foundational topics that we need to address as a priority before entering into completely new spaces in standard setting. The latter part will be subject to a consultation on whether those topics are priority or not. The first part would not be subject to consultation of whether they are, important or not important. Of course, they will be consulted on as any exposure draft when that work will translate into exposure drafts over a matter of months. The reason I'm saying this is because we've identified several pockets of extensions of our S1 and S2 in their completeness compared to where they are as exposure draft right now. So without changing anything to what Sue described about when we will be finished with the current scope of S1 and S2, that and therefore we are talking about final deliberations around the end of this year, and then as soon as possible in 23 for being ready for adoption on those ones as they are subject to the redeliberation that will occur in the next couple of months. On the add-on work, some work that is relevant to standard setting, I think can be mentioned and shared here, and that's part of the board papers. The staff is recommending that on industry-based standards, we would immediately continue on the internationalization of the SASB standards. And therefore, what I was describing about, in particular, Europe moving into their period of industry-based preparation from next year can be a timing that works with us on that, because we would not consult on whether it is important to international SASB standards. We've been discussing that for 6 months already. So the subject to the board's decision today about this, we might end up into a situation where the internationalization and globalization of SASB standards will start sort of immediately. So that's one. The maintenance of SASB standards, current SASB projects under the SASB brand is very critical as well to continue the momentum on the voluntary adoption of the SASB standards that will this year will probably double again in terms of users around the world in 22 compared to 21. And there have been ongoing research and enhancement projects that are waiting for approval by our board to move on, and which again are for some of them touching on topics because they are industry focused, of course, but sometimes there are cross themes, and one of them that were there on the shelf was a human capital project, for instance. Beyond that, what we see as well in the staff recommendation for today's discussion is extension within climate of the enablers and related sustainability topics for climate resilience. And biodiversity and water could be candidates for that, because this is the natural ecosystems agenda is integrated and more integrated in the climate, with the climate agenda, both being a factor of risk on one on the other, and also being an enabler of the climate resilience for companies in many cases. So could also be the case, and Judy is representing GRI on the Sustainability Consultative Committee of ISSB, which met for the second time last week, sorry. And you know, some commented about just transition, and meaning the social aspects of the climate transition could also be seen as a growing need for companies to engage with investors, and concerns from investors as to how much it will cost, how doable is it from a social standpoint, a reskilling standpoint. So all of that may not be part of a consultation on whether that's on the agenda or not. And so would translate into potentially immediate follow-on work, then going through consultation for exposure drafts if any of such topic would end up into making it to the line of exposure drafts in the coming months. I just wanted to say that because that is I think that's relevant to your point about the overall timing of setting the next part of the agenda for us.
Thank you very much. I've got Loredana and then Julia in the queue to speak here. Loredana?
Hello, hi. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Emmanuel, for this dialogue. I just wanted to relate a question that is posed by Evan, but since we are both remotely connecting, and he's not exactly sure of his audio connection, I'll just pass on his question here. So his question related to the distinction between mandatory and non-mandatory disclosures. And specifically, is it entirely based on feasibility or interoperability, or does it also respect political or economic restraints?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think that you're referring to my comment on the status of the industry-based standards attached to the climate document. And in that context, it's, I think, a more simple answer than the nuance that you are asking us there. So in the exposure draft, we had proposed that there would be a requirement for a company to provide industry-specific disclosures about climate risks and opportunities. And attached in Appendix B was the examples of sort of exactly what disclosures you would have to provide if you were undertaking a particular activity or you were in a particular industry in order to meet that requirement. What the staff is recommending that we do now is that we keep the requirement to provide industry-specific information. So a company would have to provide industry-specific information. We'd continue to have Appendix B as an example of what those disclosures could look like, but you wouldn't have to use those exact disclosures. They would sort of be a source of guidance and inspiration, if you like. But a company could decide to provide industry-specific information to meet the climate disclosure requirements, but craft something that they themselves had identified or were inspired by, GRI or another source of guidance, rather than being required to provide the particular disclosures in Appendix B. So they'd be sort of changing their level of their status or their mandatory nature. They'd be examples rather than requirements. That was what I was alluding to.
That answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Julia.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to make a step back because I work in NL, so I am a preparer during my week. And so I think that I totally agree that we need time to prepare standard, to approve, to consult stakeholder to do that. But I think that we can jointly accelerate a little bit in terms of materiality. Because exactly the EFRAG says that you have to perform financial materiality and impact materiality. As company, we know better the impact materiality if we follow GRI, because more or less we know, we have commented. We have this kind of big, strange part that is related to financial materiality. I think that if we accelerate on this part, could help us to prepare the first sustainability report also according to EFRAG in a correct way. Because seems to be that the TAG and the board in the EFRAG are aligned using the so-called option 3 merged with the option 4. So it means that you will have a short list of mandatory topic and the rest of the topic will be according to the materiality assessment of the company. So I think that it's not an issue in terms of KPI, but I think that if we have rapidly a coordination and agreement on materiality assessment could be really, really useful for the company to start in the correct way and not changed after 2-3 months changing of this part. KPI, we have time, but materiality, I think that is exactly the new structure of the reporting.
It's interesting that you say that because it's something that I would very strongly agree with. You're right that the path that EFRAG appears to be taking at the moment is to have a portion of their disclosures that would be mandatory and then some that are subject to a materiality assessment. So as many of you may know, what we're trying to do at the moment is to identify as many disclosures as possible where the ISSB and EFRAG could agree on a common disclosure. So we have a disclosure requirement that could be used either to meet ISSB purposes or EFRAG purposes, and that we think would be a really great outcome because it will reduce costs for companies that want to or need to apply both sets of standards. But you're exactly right that the next question is, okay, and now how do I assess materiality if I'm a company? Because of course we don't just say you have to provide all of the information, we say provide the information if it's reasonably certain to influence an investor decision, and that's how we express materiality. If the EFRAG materiality assessment that they adopt for those disclosure requirements that are not mandatory were comprised of two parts. One, a materiality assessment that, like us, is asking the question, is it reasonably certain to influence an investor decision? And then there's a second materiality test given the mandate of EFRAG, which is to test impact materiality. If we could align that first test, which is investor focused, to be the same as ours, it would be another really important step, I think, towards aligning the work that a company needs to do to apply the ISSB requirements alongside the EFRAG requirements. So I'm totally in agreement with you that that would be a fantastic outcome. In addition to the work we're doing aligning the disclosures, if we could get that linearity and alignment in the materiality assessment, I think that would be a huge, huge win for us all.
Agreed. Okay, Jennifer.
Thank you. Jennifer Prinzing from DuPont. I think my comment may be a follow-up bit on the materiality, but I was going to ask if you could say anything more about what you mentioned on collaboration around advocacy and adoption. My perspective as a reporter in the US, I think the more clarity on the why of this dual materiality concept and a seamless suite of standards that covers investor and impact materiality. I think the more education and the clarity on that to be available to corporate reporters could be extremely helpful.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Maybe I can elaborate on this for a minute. First of all, I started with that because I think that this is the essence. What really struck us when, with the leadership team of GRI, we started our discussions early spring. This is really what occurred as I just said, ensuring a cost-effective decision or information useful suite of solutions. And there is, I think, nothing more than this that needs to be said to describe what we are trying to do, because it says it all. It's not us, ISSB, walking outside of investor materiality. It's not building a double materiality concept that would be mandatory. It's about giving ability for companies and for investors or other capital providers that want to address both stakeholders groups or multiple stakeholders group to have the ability to do that with a seamless tool, basically, which is a combination of both tools that have been designed in a seamless manner. So on collaboration and adoption, I think there are several very different cases, and I would use two extremes in a way. One is, I was mentioning Global South, where historically, if you take a continent like Africa, there is a huge adoption of IFRS standards and accounting standards. So practitioners, professions are already there all over the place with the closest gap accounting systems to what we do, although we are gap agnostic, of course. And there is no doubt that we will rely as well on this legacy work that has been done by our colleagues at the IFRS Foundation, that continue to be done, and with all that network of partners and again audit firms, etc., that we can build on. And on the GRI side, there are networks in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa in particular that are building the future of that continent. And so when we are in the participating NDD Indosian, which is who is one of our board members, she's coming from Nigeria, and she's been the CSO of Dangote, one of the largest multinational companies in Africa, participates in the International Cooperation Forum in Egypt earlier in September as a pre-COP 27 event with all the ministers of finance of the African Union. We end up with a direct word of support in the communique of that forum, stating that ministers of finance are supporting the work of ISSB as a way to drive and bring to Africa more sustainable capital that will build a more resilient economy in Africa. And that's where I think the network of GRI and the network of the IFRS Foundation can really be put at work for a combined work of further adoption of each other's standards in a geography like this one. If you take the US, which it's a completely different picture. ISSB does not exist. What in the US, SEC hasn't yet resolved where they will land on their own proposals in what is mostly or closest or in the closest manner today related to our current topics, which is climate, and it will take a few more months before they're there. There is the huge momentum behind the SASB standards there. As well, I should have mentioned, of course, the IR framework in Africa, which is, of course, one of the legacies that we can use also to continue the work of adoption of the global baseline. And again, what we have in the US is SASB, and I think this is where we need to continue, as I said, to use and push for a voluntary adoption. If that can be compatible with where SEC will land, that will be all the best. If that can be supported by SEC in a way or not, that will be even better. But we don't know, and we will have a dialogue and continue dialogues with our jurisdictional working group with a number of countries, including the US, on those topics. This is to say that I personally see the US as a market where voluntary adoption will be a key driver for us. There are also already a lot of GRI adopters in the country, and again, that's another one where once we are progressing on our agenda and coming to the adoption phase sometime next year, we can think about, as I just said, events, platforms, and others that can create that synergy.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask, it looks like there might be a few questions or comments in the chat. Do we need to, could somebody read them out and just make sure that we don't have questions from the GSSB in there? Okay. All right, fine. That brings us to the end of the allotted time for this session, and I would very much like to thank the both of you, but also to your colleagues on the ISSB and the staff within the ISSB Secretariat. For the effort that you have expended, not just to come talk to us today, but also to advance the collaboration more substantively with us. You will most certainly be invited back at some point in the future, as we take more of these concrete steps together. And we very much look forward to hearing the results of your deliberations and the external inputs that you will be that you'll be taking between now and the end of the year. And please do, keep us in mind as you look to advance your agenda as well. I know you will, and we will continue to keep that line of communication open.
Thank you very much, Judy, and all colleagues on the board for having Sue and myself today. That was a pleasure, and we really look forward to the continuation of our collaboration and extension of that with the whole GRI tribe.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Have a good
Bye-bye.
day. Thanks.
All right. That brings us to the final 15-minute session here, which is really just a summary and close of today's discussion. As indicated at the beginning of today, the purpose, the kind of overall objective of this two-day meeting is really driven by the forthcoming work program. And we've had numerous inputs and food for thought shared with us over the course of today. We have missed out a little bit on a portion of the agenda that we wanted to discuss because of the technical difficulties that we've had, but I'm told that we shouldn't be too worried about that. As far as tomorrow is concerned, we should be able to carry on with it. Is there anything in particular, Bastian, that you want to make sure that we discuss now?
Maybe just to say that for the input presentations that we've had today, but also there are two more on schedule tomorrow. It would be very good if GSB members can reflect on what has been presented, because we need to decide at what level we want to cover this in the work program that we set out for public consultation, but also for staff to look at the projections for resources that we have to put into our operational planning for the next year. Of course, these are high-level inputs, but I think we need to look at the work program as a public commitment towards collaboration as well. And so any reflections that you have, follow-up questions that we can work on with the respective colleagues in the other institutions in between meetings, that would be something we would like to discuss with you tomorrow as well.
Okay, I'm not sure there's much additional summation that needs to be done at this point, but I think I'd just open it up to GSSB to share any thoughts at the close of today's meeting. Anything that you particularly want to make sure that we bear in mind or don't forget? Michel, yeah.
One point that I take is that the ISSB's agenda may very well influence our own agenda, depending on what standards they want to push out first.
I mean, I think it's essential for us to sort of keep an open mind, but also look for those opportunistic sort of moments for us to build on that relationship. Yeah, Kent.
Yeah, this presentation really helped me to understand the relationship with ISSB, which is great. It all sounded very positive. Are we going to have a similar discussion about what's happening with EFRAC and so forth?
Yeah, I did mention earlier that we have extended an invitation to EFRAC to actually come to a similar exchange at this meeting. That was for scheduling reasons not possible, but we will work with the colleagues at EFRAC and also at DJ FISMA, the European Commission, to get them into one of the, either the November or the December meeting and have a similar discussion. That might be slightly too late for an in-depth coverage in our public consultation draft for the work program. But then again, we actually have a lot more knowledge about how their program will unfold because everything that they are already fully operational with their board and technical expert group discussions, and we have more visibility on what will be happening there in the next months.
I saw a little note come in from Corley a moment ago. I'm not sure if there's anything that you want to kind of reiterate about that, Corley, but I'm glad that you've been able to get a lot from today's discussion.
No, just to say thank you and look forward to tomorrow's sessions.
Indeed. Anyone else? Great. Okay, well, with that, I think we can close the live stream, the public meeting, and indeed the agenda for today's meeting. We have a slightly later start tomorrow morning. Please refer to your agenda for our start time there. We should be on air, as it were, at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, Amsterdam time. Thank you very much for participating and listening, and we will speak again tomorrow.